Welcome to The Calm Scientist. If you're here, it probably means you're ready to slow down, relax, and drift gently into the night with a head full of curiosity. Tonight, we're going to unravel one of the most profoundly human stories in all of science, the tale of brilliant minds who saw truth where others saw madness, who stood alone against the weight of conventional wisdom, and who were ultimately beautifully vindicated by time and evidence. I do hope this won't be terribly inconvenient for your plans to drift off to sleep, but we're about to explore how some of the most fundamental truths we now take for granted were once considered so absurd, so laughable, that the people who proposed them faced mockery, professional ruin, and in some cases, tragedy. It's the kind of bedtime story only the history of human understanding could write, filled with heroes who weren't recognized as such until long after they needed that recognition most. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this gentle stroll through the graveyard of scientific certainty and the garden of vindication, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and subscribed. It really helps this cozy little channel continue its journey through the mysteries of existence. And if you're feeling sociable in that drowsy, contemplative way, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what hour finds you here. I love imagining our little global gathering of curious souls, scattered from moonlit apartments to countryside bedrooms, all connected by this shared wonder at how wrong we can be about what's right. This video is here to relax you, to fascinate you just enough to make your thoughts soft and meandering. You won't need to remember anything. Just float with me as we explore the courage it takes to see what others cannot, the price of being right too early, and the beautiful, inevitable triumph of truth over tradition. And just before we begin, this video is for relaxation and education. It is not medical advice or a substitute for professional care. Always look after yourself and sleep well. Let's start with the basics of human certainty. We like to think that science progresses in a straight line, each discovery building neatly upon the last, like a tower of knowledge reaching ever higher toward truth. It sounds so reasonable, so orderly. But hold that thought gently, because as it turns out, the history of scientific progress is much more like a garden where new ideas must often fight through the thorny undergrowth of established belief, where revolutionary truths are first treated as weeds to be pulled rather than flowers to be cultivated. There's something deeply, achingly human about our resistance to new ideas. We build our understanding of the world carefully, brick by brick, and when someone comes along suggesting that the entire foundation might be wrong, well, our first instinct isn't usually to thank them for the insight. Our first instinct is often to protect what we think we know, to defend the fortress of our understanding against what seems like an assault on reason itself. Think about it for a moment. Right now, as you lie there in the darkness, or perhaps with just a gentle light nearby, you carry with you thousands of assumptions about how the world works. The ground beneath you is solid and still. Invisible organisms couldn't possibly cause disease. Your stomach, if it hurts, must be stressed or irritated by something you ate. These things seem obvious, self-evident even, but each of these obvious truths was once a radical, ridiculed idea that someone had to fight to establish. Let me tell you about a Hungarian physician named Wegener Semmelweis, whose story unfolds in the Vienna General Hospital in 1847. Picture, if you will, two maternity wards side by side, one staffed by doctors and medical students, the other by midwives. Something strange was happening in these wards, something that would seem obvious to us now but was invisible to the medical establishment of the time. Women were dying in the doctor's ward at rates 5 times higher than in the midwife's ward. They called it childbed fever, and it was killing new mothers by the thousands. Semmelweis noticed something curious. The doctors and medical students would perform autopsies in the morning, examining the bodies of those who had died, and then, without washing their hands, would go directly to deliver babies and examine pregnant women. The midwives, on the other hand, never performed autopsies. It's almost painful to imagine now, isn't it? These learned men of medicine carrying invisible death on their hands from the morgue to the maternity ward, completely unaware of the tragedy they were perpetrating. When Semmelweis suggested that doctors should wash their hands in chlorinated lime water between autopsy work and patient examination, the reaction wasn't gratitude or curiosity. It was outrage. How dare this Hungarian suggest that gentlemen's hands could be unclean? How dare he imply that doctors, healers, were actually killing their patients? The very idea seemed not just wrong but insulting, offensive to the dignity of the medical profession. Semmelweis had the data. When he instituted mandatory hand-washing in his ward, the mortality rate plummeted from 18% to less than 2%, 18% to 2%. Think about that transformation, hundreds of women's lives saved by something as simple as washing hands. But the medical establishment didn't celebrate this discovery. They rejected it. They ridiculed it. They found every reason to dismiss the evidence. Part of the resistance came from the lack of a theoretical framework. Semmelweis couldn't explain why hand-washing worked because germ theory hadn't been developed yet. He could only point to the results, the dramatic drop in deaths. But without a mechanism to explain it, his colleagues found it easy to dismiss his findings as coincidence or flawed methodology. It's a bit like someone today claiming they could prevent car accidents by hanging fuzzy dice from the rearview mirror and pointing to statistics that seem to support it. Without understanding the underlying mechanism, even compelling evidence can seem like mere correlation. But there was something deeper at work in the rejection of Semmelweis's discovery, something that touches on the very nature of how we construct our professional and personal identities. These doctors had built their careers, their sense of self, their understanding of their role as healers, on certain assumptions about disease and cleanliness. To accept Semmelweis's findings meant accepting that they had been inadvertently killing patients for years, possibly decades. That's not just a scientific revelation, it's a personal catastrophe, a shattering of self, image that few people can easily embrace. The tragedy of Semmelweis deepened as the years passed. His frustration at watching preventable deaths continue while his life-saving discovery was ignored began to affect his mental health. He became increasingly angry and bitter, writing open letters condemning his colleagues as murderers. His behaviour became erratic. In 1865, he was committed to an asylum where, in a bitter irony that seems almost too cruel to be true, he died of septicemia, an infection not unlike the childbed fever he had fought so hard to prevent, possibly from beatings by the asylum guards. 20 years after his death, Louis Pasteur's germ theory would provide the theoretical framework that explained why Semmelweis had been right all along. Those invisible organisms, those microbes that no one could see or imagine, were indeed the culprits. Hand-washing removed them, prevented their transmission, saved lives. Semmelweis was vindicated, but too late for him to know it. Too late for the thousands of women who died in those intervening decades. There's something profoundly sad about posthumous vindication, isn't there? The rightness of an idea doesn't protect the person who first sees it. Truth doesn't shield its messengers from the slings and arrows of those who aren't ready to hear it. And yet, these early truth seers persist, driven by something stronger than the need for approval or acceptance. They're driven by the evidence itself, by the undeniable reality of what they've observed, even when that reality seems impossible to everyone else. Let's drift now from the hospitals of Vienna to the broader landscape of our planet itself, to another revolutionary idea that seemed absolutely absurd when first proposed. In 1912, a German meteorologist named Alfred Wegener noticed something that seems obvious when you look at a world map. The continents look like they fit together like puzzle pieces. The eastern coast of South America nestles quite nicely into the western coast of Africa. Coincidence? Wegener didn't think so. But Wegener went further than just noting the visual similarity. He found identical fossils on opposite sides of the Atlantic Ocean. He discovered mountain ranges that seemed to continue from one continent to another when you imagined pushing them together. He found evidence of tropical plants in Arctic regions and glacial deposits in places that are now desert. All of this evidence pointed to something that seemed impossible. The continents moved. Imagine proposing this to a room full of geologists in 1912. These learned scientists who had spent their careers studying the solid, dependable Earth. And here comes this meteorologist, not even a proper geologist, suggesting that entire continents drift around like rafts on a pond. The reaction was not kind. They called his theory utter damned rot. They dismissed him as an amateur dabbling in things he didn't understand. One critic compared his method to someone trying to fit the torn pieces of a newspaper together by their edges while ignoring the printed text. The fundamental problem with Wegener's theory The reason it was so easy to dismiss was that he couldn't explain how continents could move. What force could possibly be strong enough to push entire continents across the face of the Earth? Without a mechanism, his theory seemed like fantasy, like suggesting that buildings walk around at night when no one's watching. The evidence was there: fossils, geology, climate patterns. But without an explanation for how it could happen, the scientific community found it easier to explain away each piece of evidence individually, rather than accept the radical whole. Wegener spent the rest of his life gathering more evidence, refining his arguments, trying to convince a skeptical scientific community. He died in 1930 on an expedition to Greenland, his body lost in the ice, his theory still widely rejected. It would be another 30 years before the discovery of seafloor spreading and the development of plate tectonic theory would provide the mechanism Wegener couldn't find. The continents do indeed move, carried on vast plates of the Earth's crust that float on the semi-liquid mantle below, spreading apart at some boundaries, colliding at others, creating mountains and valleys, earthquakes and volcanoes. Think about that for a moment. The ground beneath you, which seems so solid, so permanent, is actually in constant slow motion. North America and Europe are drifting apart at about the same rate your fingernails grow. India is still crashing into Asia, pushing the Himalayas a little bit higher each year. The Earth's surface is a dynamic, living thing, constantly reshaping itself over millions of years. Wegener was right, completely beautifully right, but he died believing himself a failure, his life's work dismissed by those who should have recognized its brilliance. There's a pattern emerging here, isn't it? The person who sees a truth before the world is ready for it often pays a price for their vision. They're not celebrated as pioneers but dismissed as cranks. They're not lifted up but torn down. And often, tragically often, they don't live to see their vindication. But let's explore a more recent example, one that shows this pattern isn't confined to the distant past. In 1982, two Australian physicians, Barry Marshall and Robin Warren, made a claim that seemed to fly in the face of everything the medical community knew about stomach ulcers. For decades, medical textbooks had taught that ulcers were caused by stress, spicy food, and excess stomach acid. The treatment was antacids, bland diets, and sometimes surgery. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry built on this understanding, and then Marshall and Warren came along and said, actually, most ulcers are caused by bacteria. The medical community's reaction was swift and dismissive. How could bacteria possibly survive in the acidic environment of the stomach? The stomach's acid is strong enough to dissolve metal. Surely no bacteria could live there. It was like claiming fish could live in boiling water. The idea was so absurd that many didn't even bother to look at Marshall and Warren's evidence. But Marshall and Warren had indeed found bacteria in the stomachs of patients with ulcers, specifically a spiral-shaped bacterium they called Helicobacter pylori. They had evidence, clear microscopic evidence, but the medical establishment wasn't interested. The idea contradicted everything they thought they knew about the stomach's hostile environment. More than that, it threatened an entire industry built around treating ulcers as a chronic condition requiring ongoing management. Marshall grew increasingly frustrated. People were suffering unnecessarily, undergoing surgery, living restricted lives, taking medications that only managed symptoms without addressing the cause. And he knew that a simple course of antibiotics could cure most of them, but no one would listen. So, in an act of desperation and scientific conviction that still makes researchers gasp, Marshall did something extraordinary. He drank a beaker full of Helicobacter pylori culture. Think about that for a moment. A doctor, knowing full well what he believed would happen, intentionally infected himself with bacteria to prove a point. It's the kind of thing that sounds like mythology, like something from an ancient tale of sacrifice for truth. But this happened in 1984, not in some distant romantic past, but in the modern era of institutional review boards and ethical committees. Within days, Marshall developed gastritis, the precursor to ulcers. He had proven that the bacteria could colonize the stomach and cause disease. He then cured himself with antibiotics, demonstrating that the condition could be treated simply and effectively. It was a dramatic gesture, the kind of thing that should have immediately changed medical practice. But even this didn't convince everyone. It would take years more of studies, evidence, and gradual acceptance before the medical community fully embraced what Marshall and Warren had discovered. In 2005, Marshall and Warren received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for their discovery. By then, the treatment of ulcers had been revolutionized. Millions of people had been cured with simple antibiotic treatments. The multi-billion-dollar antacid industry had to adapt to a new reality. What had once been considered a chronic condition requiring lifelong management became something that could be cured in a matter of weeks. But here's something interesting about the resistance to Marshall and Warren's discovery. It wasn't just about scientific skepticism or protecting financial interests. There was something deeper at play, something about how we construct our understanding of cause and effect, especially when it comes to our own bodies. The idea that stress causes ulcers makes intuitive sense. We can feel stress in our stomachs, that tight, churning sensation when we're anxious or overwhelmed. The connection between our emotional state and our digestive system seems obvious, immediate, undeniable. The idea that bacteria cause ulcers, on the other hand, removes human agency from the equation. It's not about how you live your life or manage your stress. It's about microscopic invaders you can't see or control. In some ways, this is liberating. You're not to blame for your ulcer. It's not a character flaw or a failure to manage stress properly. But in other ways, it's unsettling. We like to believe we have control over our health through our choices and behaviors. The idea that invisible organisms can make us sick regardless of how we live challenges that sense of control. This tension between what feels intuitively true and what the evidence actually shows appears again and again in the history of ridiculed ideas that proved correct. Let's travel back further in time, to the late 18th century, when the very idea that rocks could fall from the sky was considered absurd by the scientific establishment. Throughout human history, people had reported seeing stones fall from the heavens. Farmers would find strange rocks in their fields after witnessing fiery streaks across the sky. But by the Age of Enlightenment, educated people knew better. The heavens were perfect, ethereal, certainly not full of rocks waiting to fall on unsuspecting heads. When peasants brought these sky stones to scientists, they were dismissed as confused, superstitious, or fraudulent. The French Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world, was particularly dismissive. Antoine Lavoisier, the father of modern chemistry, examined a stone that had reportedly fallen from the sky and declared it to be nothing more than ordinary earth rock that had been struck by lightning. He famously stated that stones cannot fall from the sky because there are no stones in the sky. It's such a perfectly logical statement, isn't it? The reasoning is flawless if you accept the premise. But the premise was wrong. Think about the worldview that made meteorites seem impossible. The heavens were understood to be fundamentally different from Earth, composed of different substances governed by different laws. The idea that the same kind of matter that makes up Earth rocks could be floating around in space seemed to violate the basic organization of the universe as they understood it. It would be like suggesting that fish could live in trees or that clouds were made of soil. It didn't fit the categories through which they understood reality. But the reports kept coming. In 1794, German physicist Ernst Chladni published a book arguing that meteorites were indeed extraterrestrial in origin. He was ridiculed. How could a serious scientist believe such folklore? But Chladni had done something the dismissive scientists hadn't. He had actually investigated the reports, examined the stones, and noticed patterns that couldn't be explained by lightning strikes or volcanic activity. The turning point came in 1803 when a spectacular meteor shower occurred over L'Aigle in France. Thousands of stones fell from the sky in broad daylight, witnessed by numerous respectable citizens. The French Academy sent Jean-Baptiste Biot to investigate, expecting him to debunk the claims. Instead, Biot confirmed that the stones had indeed fallen from the sky and were unlike any Earth rocks. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. The scientific community had to accept what peasants had been saying for centuries. Rocks do fall from the sky. What's particularly interesting about the meteorite controversy is how it reveals the danger of dismissing evidence based on theoretical impossibility. The scientists who rejected meteorites weren't being stupid or stubborn. They were being logical within their understanding of how the universe worked. But their logic was constrained by their assumptions, and their assumptions were wrong. They had constructed a mental model of the cosmos that didn't include space rocks, and rather than questioning the model when presented with evidence of space rocks, they questioned the evidence. This same pattern, rejecting evidence because it doesn't fit the current model, appears throughout the history of science. It happened with the germ theory of disease, with the heliocentric model of the solar system, with evolution, with quantum mechanics. Each time, the established understanding seemed so obviously correct that contradicting evidence was dismissed as error, fraud, or delusion, and each time, eventually, the evidence won. Let's delve deeper into one of the most dramatic examples of this pattern, the story of childbed fever and the man who could have prevented thousands of deaths if only people had listened. We touched on Semmelweis earlier, but there's so much more to explore about how his discovery was rejected and the human cost of that rejection. Picture the Vienna General Hospital in the 1840s. It was one of the most prestigious medical institutions in Europe, a teaching hospital where the best and brightest came to learn the art of medicine. The maternity ward was divided into two sections, the first clinic run by doctors and medical students, and the second clinic run by midwives. Women admitted to the hospital were assigned to one clinic or the other on alternating days. It should have been a random distribution, the outcomes should have been the same, but they weren't, not even close. The first clinic, the one run by doctors, had a maternal mortality rate that sometimes exceeded 18%. Nearly 1 in 5 women who gave birth there died of childbed fever. The second clinic, run by midwives, had a mortality rate of less than 2%. The difference was so well known that women would beg, literally beg on their knees, not to be admitted to the first clinic. Some would rather give birth in the streets than enter the doctor's ward. Semmelweis was haunted by these numbers. As assistant to the professor of obstetrics, he had access to all the data, and the data was damning. But what could explain it? The doctors were better educated than the midwives. They had more training, more knowledge of anatomy and physiology. If anything, their clinic should have had better outcomes, not worse. Various theories were proposed. The doctor's clinic was more crowded. The women there were more frightened. Bad air was circulating differently. The idea of antimatter seemed like science fiction. For every particle, there was an antiparticle with opposite properties. When matter and antimatter met, they would annihilate each other in a burst of pure energy? It sounded more like fantasy than physics. Many physicists thought Dirac was overthinking his equations, finding meaning where there was only mathematical artifact. But in 1932, Carl Anderson discovered the positron, the anti-electron, in cosmic ray experiments. He wasn't looking for antimatter. He didn't even know about Dirac's prediction initially, but there it was, a particle that behaved exactly like an electron but curved the wrong way in a magnetic field, indicating opposite charge. Antimatter was real. The discovery of antimatter raised profound questions. Why is the universe made of matter rather than antimatter? If the Big Bang created equal amounts of both, where did all the antimatter go? These questions still puzzle physicists today. What started as an embarrassing feature of an equation became one of the deepest mysteries in cosmology. This pattern of mathematical prediction preceding experimental discovery appears throughout modern physics. The Higgs boson was predicted in 1964, but not discovered until 2012. Gravitational waves were predicted by Einstein in 1916, but not detected until 2015. Black holes were predicted by Schwarzschild in 1916, but not observationally confirmed until the 1970s. Each of these predictions faced skepticism. The Higgs mechanism seemed like an arbitrary addition to make theories work. Gravitational waves were so weak that Einstein himself doubted they could ever be detected. Black holes seemed to violate common sense, regions where space and time broke down, where the laws of physics ceased to apply, yet all proved real. There's something profound about the universe being mathematical enough that our equations can reveal aspects of reality we haven't yet observed. It suggests that mathematics isn't just a human invention, but a fundamental feature of nature. When our mathematics predicts something strange, we should pay attention, even if it seems absurd. Let's turn to another domain where revolutionary ideas faced resistance, our understanding of human prehistory and the age of humanity itself. For most of Western history, humans were thought to have existed for only a few thousand years, specially created in their current form. The idea that humans had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, that we had evolved from earlier forms, that there were other human species, seemed to contradict both religious teachings and the apparent uniqueness of humanity. The discovery of Neanderthal fossils in the 1850s provided the first clear evidence of another human species. But the initial reaction was denial. These must be diseased or deformed modern humans, not a separate species. The idea that there were other kinds of humans, that we weren't unique, was deeply unsettling. It suggested that being human wasn't a binary state but a spectrum, that there could be degrees of humanity. As more fossils were discovered, the picture became more complex and more challenging to human exceptionalism. Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Australopithecus, each discovery pushed human origins further back in time and revealed more intermediate forms between apes and modern humans. The clean line between human and animal became increasingly blurred. The discovery of stone tools in Africa dating back millions of years challenged assumptions about human uniqueness. Tool use was supposed to be distinctively human, proof of our special status. But here were tools older than any human fossils, made by creatures that weren't quite human yet. The boundaries of humanity kept expanding backward in time and outward in definition. Even more disturbing to human exceptionalism was the discovery that Neanderthals had culture. They buried their dead, sometimes with flowers. They made jewelry and art. They had bigger brains than modern humans. They weren't brutish cavemen, but sophisticated beings with their own form of humanity. Yet they went extinct while we survived, a reminder that intelligence and culture don't guarantee survival. The recent discovery through DNA analysis that modern humans interbred with Neanderthals and other archaic humans has further complicated our understanding of human origins. Most people of European and Asian descent carry Neanderthal DNA. We're not pure Homo sapiens, but hybrids, carrying genes from extinct human species. The story of human origins isn't a simple progression, but a complex web of interactions, migrations, and extinctions. Accepting the deep history of humanity required abandoning the idea that humans are separate from nature, that we're specially created rather than evolved. It meant acknowledging that we're animals, unusually clever animals perhaps, but animals nonetheless. No wonder the idea faced such resistance. No wonder it still does in some quarters. This brings us to consider the general pattern of resistance to ideas that challenge human specialness. Whether it's evolution showing we're modified apes, genetics showing we share most of our DNA with other species, or neuroscience showing our thoughts and feelings are brain states, we resist ideas that make us seem less unique, less special, less divinely ordained. Let's explore one more domain where revolutionary ideas faced ridicule before acceptance: the nature of energy and heat. For centuries, heat was thought to be a substance called caloric, a fluid that flowed from hot objects to cold ones. Fire released caloric, ice absorbed it. This theory explained many observations and made intuitive sense. When you put your hand near a fire, you could feel the caloric flowing into it. The caloric theory was so well established that it seemed absurd to suggest heat was something else. Yet experiments in the late 18th and early 19th centuries began to show problems. Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, observed that boring cannons produced seemingly unlimited heat through friction. If heat was a substance, where was it coming from? You could generate heat indefinitely through mechanical work, which didn't make sense if heat was a conserved fluid. James Joule performed careful experiments in the 1840s showing that mechanical work could be converted into heat in precise, predictable amounts. He suggested that heat wasn't a substance but a form of motion, specifically the motion of atoms and molecules. This was revolutionary. Heat, which seemed so obviously to be something flowing between objects, was actually the jiggling of invisible particles. The resistance to the mechanical theory of heat was substantial. The caloric theory worked well for most applications. Engineers used it to design steam engines. Chemists used it to understand reactions. To abandon it for a theory based on invisible atomic motion seemed unnecessary and speculative. Many scientists preferred to modify the caloric theory rather than abandon it entirely. The acceptance of heat as molecular motion was gradual and tied to the acceptance of atomic theory itself. If you didn't believe in atoms, you couldn't believe heat was atomic motion. Even as evidence accumulated, some scientists maintained that caloric theory and mechanical theory were just different ways of describing the same phenomena, that the truth might be somewhere in between. The triumph of the mechanical theory of heat had profound implications. It established the principle of energy conservation, that energy could change forms but couldn't be created or destroyed. It connected previously separate phenomena, showing that heat, light, electricity, motion, and chemical energy were all forms of the same fundamental quantity. It laid the groundwork for thermodynamics, which would reveal fundamental limits on what was possible in the universe. The story of heat illustrates how successful wrong theories can be. Caloric theory worked well enough for most purposes. Engineers designed functional steam engines using it. Only when pushed to extremes, when asked to explain unlimited heat from friction or precise mechanical equivalents, did it fail. This raises uncomfortable questions. What successful theories do we use today that are fundamentally wrong but work well enough that we don't notice? We've explored many examples of ridiculed ideas that proved true, from handwashing to continental drift, from germs to antimatter. But let's take a moment to reflect on what these stories tell us about the nature of scientific progress and human psychology. First, there's the role of authority and expertise. Many revolutionary ideas were rejected not because they lacked evidence, but because they came from the wrong people. Semmelweis was Hungarian in Austrian Vienna. Wegener was a meteorologist proposing geological theories. Marshall and Warren were unknowns from Australia. The source of an idea often matters more than its content, at least initially. Second, there's the power of theoretical frameworks to blind us to evidence. Scientists examining meteorites couldn't see them as extraterrestrial because their cosmology didn't include space rocks. Doctors couldn't accept bacterial causes of ulcers because their framework said bacteria couldn't survive stomach acid. We see what our theories tell us to expect and we explain away what doesn't fit. Third, there's the role of technological limitations. Many correct ideas couldn't be proven when first proposed because the necessary tools didn't exist. Harvey couldn't see capillaries. Wegener couldn't detect seafloor spreading. The delay between proposal and proof can be decades or centuries, during which correct ideas are dismissed as speculation. Fourth, there's the human cost of resistance to new ideas. Every year that handwashing was rejected meant thousands of preventable deaths. Every year that ulcer treatment focused on stress rather than bacteria meant unnecessary suffering. The cost of scientific conservatism isn't just delayed knowledge, but real human suffering. Fifth, there's the role of economic and social interests. Industries built on wrong theories resist change. Careers invested in failed paradigms fight to preserve them. Social hierarchies threatened by new ideas mobilize against them. Science doesn't occur in a vacuum, but in a world of money, power, and privilege. These patterns suggest uncomfortable questions about our current scientific beliefs. What ideas are we rejecting today that will seem obviously true to future generations? What evidence are we explaining away because it doesn't fit our theories? What suffering are we perpetuating by refusing to consider alternatives to established doctrine? There are probably ideas being proposed right now that seem absurd but are actually correct. Someone, somewhere, might be seeing a truth that the rest of us are blind to. They're facing ridicule, rejection, perhaps even persecution. History suggests they might be right, but we won't know for years or decades. This doesn't mean we should accept every fringe theory or abandon scientific skepticism. Most revolutionary claims are wrong. For every Semmelweis or Wegener, there are hundreds of cranks proposing perpetual motion machines or claiming to have disproven relativity. The difficulty is distinguishing genuine revolutionary insights from appealing nonsense. Perhaps the lesson is to hold our certainties lightly, to remember that what seems obviously true to us might be obviously false to our descendants, to maintain what Richard Feynman called a satisfactory philosophy of ignorance, acknowledging how much we don't know, how often we've been wrong, how likely we are to be wrong again. Let's delve deeper into some of the psychological and sociological factors that contribute to the rejection of revolutionary ideas. Understanding these patterns might help us be more open to genuine innovations while still maintaining appropriate skepticism. One factor is the curse of knowledge. Once we've learned something, it's hard to imagine not knowing it. This makes it difficult to understand why others don't see what seems obvious to us. Semmelweis couldn't understand why other doctors didn't see the connection between autopsies and childbed fever once he'd seen it. But without germ theory, the connection wasn't obvious at all. Another factor is confirmation bias. We pay attention to evidence that confirms our beliefs and ignore or explain away evidence that contradicts them. Geologists who rejected continental drift could explain each piece of Wegener's evidence individually, even though the collective evidence was overwhelming. We're all guilty of this, seeing what we expect to see, finding patterns that confirm our preconceptions. There's also the sunk cost fallacy. Scientists who have spent careers developing theories are reluctant to abandon them. It's not just ego, though ego plays a role. It's the pain of admitting that years or decades of work were based on false premises. The more invested we are in an idea, the harder it is to let go, even when evidence mounts against it. Social proof plays a role too. We look to others to validate our beliefs. If respected authorities reject an idea, we're likely to reject it too. This creates a cascade effect where initial rejection leads to widespread dismissal, regardless of evidence. Young scientists, dependent on established scientists for jobs and grants, are particularly vulnerable to this pressure. The complexity of revolutionary ideas can also contribute to their rejection. Plate tectonics required understanding of seafloor spreading, magnetic reversals, convection currents, and more. Quantum mechanics required new mathematics and abandoning classical intuitions. Simple wrong ideas often persist because they are easier to understand than complex correct ones. Then there's the role of metaphor and analogy in scientific thinking. We understand new ideas by comparing them to familiar ones, but sometimes the available metaphors are inadequate or misleading. Calling DNA a blueprint, the brain a computer, or evolution a ladder can help understanding but also constrain it. Revolutionary ideas often require new metaphors that don't yet exist. Let's consider too the role of aesthetics in science. Scientists often speak of theories being beautiful, elegant, or ugly. There's a belief that correct theories should be aesthetically pleasing, that nature prefers simplicity and symmetry. But this aesthetic sense can lead us astray. Nature is under no obligation to conform to our ideas of beauty. Maxwell's equations were considered ugly when first proposed because they weren't symmetrical. It took decades to reformulate them in the elegant form we know today. Quantum mechanics still strikes many as ugly, with its probabilistic nature and measurement dependence. Yet it's the most successful theory in physics. Sometimes truth is messy. There's also the issue of interdisciplinary blindness. Specialists in one field often reject insights from other fields. Geologists dismissed Wegener partly because he was a meteorologist. Physicists dismissed chemistry, chemists dismissed biology, biologists dismissed psychology. Revolutionary insights often come from outsiders who aren't constrained by disciplinary assumptions. The role of timing in the acceptance of revolutionary ideas is crucial too. The same idea proposed at different times might be rejected or accepted depending on the intellectual climate. Mendel's genetics was ignored in 1866, but celebrated when rediscovered in 1900. The world wasn't ready for genes until it was. Sometimes ideas are rejected because they're too far ahead of their time, requiring conceptual frameworks that don't yet exist. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric solar system in ancient Greece, but without the physics to explain why we don't feel Earth's motion, it couldn't compete with geocentrism. The idea was right, but premature. We should also consider the role of language in scientific revolutions. New ideas often require new vocabulary. Wegener spoke of continental drift, but the modern theory speaks of plate tectonics. The shift in language reflects a shift in understanding. Sometimes ideas are rejected simply because we lack the words to express them clearly. The social dynamics of scientific communities play a crucial role. Science is often portrayed as objective and rational, but it's done by humans with all their biases, emotions, and social needs. Scientists form tribes around theories, defend territory, engage in power struggles. Revolutionary ideas threaten not just scientific understanding, but social structures. Consider the role of scientific journals and peer review. These institutions are meant to ensure quality, but they can also enforce conformity. Revolutionary papers are often rejected by journals, not because they're wrong, but because they're too different. Wegener struggled to publish his continental drift ideas. Prusiner faced repeated rejections for his prion papers. There's also the Matthew effect in science, where credit goes to those who already have it. Famous scientists proposing revolutionary ideas are more likely to be heard than unknowns. If Einstein had been a patent clerk forever, would anyone have paid attention to relativity? How many Einsteins have we ignored because they lacked credentials or connections? The role of funding in scientific progress cannot be ignored. Revolutionary research is risky. Grant committees prefer safe projects likely to produce results. This creates a conservative bias, where incremental improvements are funded over radical innovations. How many revolutionary ideas die not from scientific rejection, but from financial starvation? Let's also consider the role of scientific education in perpetuating orthodoxy. Textbooks present science as settled fact rather than ongoing inquiry. Students learn the right answers rather than how to question. By the time scientists are established enough to challenge orthodoxy, they've been thoroughly indoctrinated into it. The pressure to publish creates its own problems. Scientists need publications for career advancement, which encourages safe incremental research over risky revolutionary work. It's better for your career to publish 10 papers confirming existing theories than one paper challenging them, even if that one paper might change everything. We haven't fully explored the role of nationalism and cultural bias in scientific acceptance. Chinese traditional medicine was dismissed by Western science for decades, only to have some treatments validated later. Indigenous knowledge about medicinal plants was ignored until pharmaceutical companies found profit in it. How much wisdom have we rejected simply because it came from the wrong culture? The gender dynamics of scientific rejection deserve attention too. Women scientists have faced additional barriers to having their revolutionary ideas accepted. Rosalind Franklin's crucial work on DNA structure was marginalized. Barbara McClintock's discovery of genetic transposition was ignored for decades. Lisa Meitner's role in discovering nuclear fission was overlooked. The intersection of gender bias and scientific conservatism has suppressed many revolutionary insights. This brings us to a deeper consideration of what we might be missing today. In our current scientific landscape, what revolutionary ideas are being dismissed? What evidence are we explaining away? What biases are blinding us to truth? Consider consciousness studies. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from objective processes, remains unsolved. Various theories are proposed from panpsychism to integrated information theory, but many are dismissed as unscientific. Are we rejecting correct theories of consciousness because they don't fit our materialist framework? Will future scientists look back at our dismissal of consciousness theories the way we look back at the dismissal of continental drift? Or consider alternative medicine. Much of it is indeed nonsense, but are we throwing out babies with bathwater? Acupuncture was dismissed as placebo until brain imaging showed it actually affects neural activity. Meditation was considered New Age fluff until neuroscience revealed its profound effects on brain structure. What other traditional practices might have scientific validity that we're ignoring because they don't fit our paradigms? The study of unidentified aerial phenomena, recently rebranded from UFOs, provides another example. For decades, anyone studying these phenomena seriously risked career suicide. Now, with military videos and congressional hearings, it's becoming legitimate to investigate. Will we be ignoring important data about atmospheric phenomena, advanced technology, or something else because of social stigma rather than scientific reasoning? Climate science offers a different perspective. Here, the revolutionary idea that humans could alter global climate was initially dismissed, then gradually accepted as evidence mounted. But even after scientific consensus formed, political and economic interests continued to promote doubt. This shows how acceptance of revolutionary ideas can be delayed not just by scientific conservatism, but by external forces. The microbiome revolution we discussed earlier is still ongoing, and we're probably only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The idea that bacteria influence not just digestion but mood, behavior, perhaps even consciousness, challenges our understanding of what makes us human. Are we resisting the full implications because they threaten our sense of individual autonomy? In physics, string theory has dominated theoretical physics for decades, despite lack of experimental evidence. Meanwhile, alternative approaches like loop quantum gravity receive less attention and funding. Are we repeating the pattern of defending an elegant but wrong theory against less beautiful but more correct alternatives? Only time will tell. The possibility of life elsewhere in the universe represents another domain where scientific conservatism might be holding us back. The Drake equation suggests millions of civilizations might exist, Yet we see no evidence, the Fermi paradox. Various solutions are proposed, from rare earth to great filters to zoo hypotheses. Are we dismissing the correct answer because it's too unsettling? Consider too the nascent field of morphic resonance proposed by Rupert Sheldrake, suggesting that patterns of activity become increasingly probable the more often they occur. Most scientists dismiss this as pseudoscience, but what if there's something to it? What if we're missing a fundamental organizing principle of nature because it doesn't fit our current frameworks? The question of whether artificial intelligence could become conscious is another area where we might be blind to revolutionary possibilities. Most assume consciousness requires biological brains, but why should that be true? If we create artificial general intelligence that claims to be conscious, how would we know if it's right? Are we dismissing the possibility because it threatens human uniqueness? These contemporary examples illustrate that the pattern of rejecting revolutionary ideas continues. We haven't become more open-minded just because we know about past mistakes. Each generation thinks it's more enlightened than the last, less prone to dogma and bias. But the psychological and sociological forces that led to rejecting hand-washing and continental drift still operate today. So, what can we learn from all these stories of ridiculed ideas that prove true? Perhaps the most important lesson is humility. We should hold our scientific beliefs firmly enough to act on them, but lightly enough to change them when evidence demands. We should remember that certainty has been the enemy of truth throughout history. We should also cultivate what we might call productive skepticism, questioning established ideas without falling into denialism or conspiracy thinking. The key is to follow evidence wherever it leads, even when it leads to uncomfortable places. To ask, not, is this idea crazy, but is it crazy enough to be true? There's value in protecting mavericks and outsiders who challenge orthodoxy. Not because they're usually right, they're usually wrong, but because occasionally they see what insiders miss. Institutions should create space for revolutionary thinking, even at the risk of wasting resources on failed ideas. The cost of missing one revolutionary truth might exceed the cost of pursuing 100 revolutionary failures. We should be especially attentive to ideas that come from unexpected sources, from other disciplines, from other cultures, from marginalized voices. Revolutionary insights often come from the margins, from those who aren't fully invested in existing paradigms. The next Semmelweis might be someone we're not listening to because they don't have the right credentials or speak with the right accent. The stories we've explored also suggest the importance of patience and persistence for those who believe they've discovered revolutionary truths. Vindication might not come in your lifetime. Wegener died believing himself a failure. Mendel's work was recognized only posthumously. The truth will eventually prevail, but perhaps not soon enough for you to see it. For the rest of us, these stories counsel openness to ideas that initially seem absurd. When someone claims that stomach ulcers are caused by bacteria, that continents move, that rocks fall from space, our first instinct might be to laugh. But history suggests we should at least look at the evidence before dismissing claims that contradict what we think we know. There's something beautiful about these stories of vindication, isn't there? They show that truth has a power that eventually overcomes human resistance. No amount of ridicule could keep continents from drifting, bacteria from causing disease, or atoms from existing. Reality doesn't care about our opinions. It simply is what it is, waiting patiently for us to discover it. But there's also something tragic about these stories. Each represents unnecessary suffering, delayed progress, wasted lives. How many women died in childbirth because Semmelweis was ignored? How many patients suffered from ulcers because Marshall and Warren weren't believed? The cost of scientific conservatism is measured not just in delayed knowledge, but in human pain. As we lie here in the darkness, perhaps preparing for sleep, it's worth reflecting on the nature of truth and our relationship to it. We're pattern-seeking creatures, constantly trying to make sense of the world around us. But the patterns we see are shaped by our expectations, our cultures, our limitations. The real patterns might be quite different from what we perceive. Think about the ground beneath you, which seems so solid and still. But now you know it's moving, carried on a tectonic plate at about the speed your fingernails grow. The Americas are drifting away from Europe and Africa. India is still crashing into Asia. The Earth's surface is in constant slow motion, reshaping itself over millions of years. Wegener was right. Think about the air you're breathing, which seems empty and clean, but now you know it's full of microorganisms, bacteria, viruses, fungal spores, an invisible ecosystem swirling around and through you. Most of these organisms are harmless or beneficial, but some could kill you if your immune system wasn't constantly vigilant. The germ theorists were right. Think about your own body, which seems like a single unified organism. But now you know you're a community, a walking ecosystem harboring trillions of bacteria that are essential for your health. You're not just human, but a human microbial superorganism, dependent on creatures too small to see. The microbiome researchers were right. Think about the very atoms that make up your body, which seem permanent and unchanging. But now you know they're mostly empty space, that they were forged in the hearts of dying stars, that they've been recycled through countless organisms before becoming temporarily you. The atomic theorists were right, though the truth was stranger than they imagined. All these revolutionary ideas that once seemed absurd are now just part of how we understand the world. What seems revolutionary to one generation becomes obvious to the next. Our children will grow up knowing truths that we had to struggle to accept, and they'll discover new truths that seem absurd to us. This is the beautiful, frustrating, humbling nature of scientific progress. We're always wrong about something, usually many things, but we're less wrong than we used to be, and our descendants will be less wrong than us. Each generation sees a little further, understands a little more, approaches a little closer to truth. The stories we've explored tonight remind us that knowledge is hard-won, that truth often comes at a price, that being right too early can be as dangerous as being wrong. They remind us that we should be suspicious of certainty, our own most of all. They remind us that the universe is stranger than we imagine, probably stranger than we can imagine. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps you can take comfort in knowing that we're part of this great human endeavour, this multi-generational project of trying to understand reality. We're links in a chain stretching from ancient philosophers pondering the nature of matter to future scientists discovering truths we can't yet conceive. We're part of the story, even if we're not the heroes. And who knows, maybe tomorrow someone will propose an idea that seems completely absurd, that contradicts everything we think we know. Maybe they'll be ridiculed, dismissed, ignored, but maybe, just maybe, they'll be right. And someday, perhaps long after they're gone, the world will realize that what seemed like madness was actually insight, that what seemed impossible was actually inevitable. The history of science is littered with impossible things that turned out to be true. Rocks do fall from the sky, continents do drift across the Earth's surface, invisible organisms do cause disease, time does run at different rates for different observers, particles can be in two places at once. The impossible happens all the time, we just don't recognize it until later. So as we come to the end of our journey through ridiculed ideas that prove true, let's remember to approach the world with wonder rather than certainty, with curiosity rather than dogma, with openness rather than defensiveness. Let's remember that today's absurdity might be tomorrow's common knowledge, that today's crank might be tomorrow's genius, that today's impossibility might be tomorrow's reality. The universe doesn't owe us comprehensibility. It doesn't have to make sense to our primate brains evolved for surviving on African savannas. The fact that we can understand any of it is remarkable. The fact that we keep discovering new truths, even when they contradict our deepest intuitions, is a testament to both the power of the scientific method and the flexibility of human understanding. In the quiet of the night, when the world softens and slows, we can perhaps feel a connection to all those truth seekers who came before us. Semmelweis, desperately trying to save mothers and babies, knowing the answer but unable to make others see. Wegener trekking across Greenland's ice, gathering evidence for continental drift even as his colleagues dismissed him. Marshall drinking bacteria to prove a point that seemed obvious to him but absurd to others. They were all trying to reduce suffering, to increase understanding, to inch us closer to truth. They paid prices we can barely imagine. Professional ruin, social isolation, mental breakdown, sometimes death. But they persisted because they had seen something true, and truth has a weight that's hard to ignore once you've felt it. We honour them not by accepting every wild idea that comes along, but by remaining open to evidence, by questioning our assumptions, by remembering that we might be wrong about things that seem obviously right. We honor them by being willing to change our minds when evidence demands it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it threatens our worldview. The story of ridiculed ideas that prove true is ultimately a story about the triumph of truth over prejudice, of evidence over assumption, of reality over ideology. It's a slow triumph, often taking generations, but it's inexorable. Truth might be suppressed, ignored, ridiculed, but it can't be destroyed. It waits patiently for us to be ready to see it. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought as we prepare for sleep. That truth exists independently of our beliefs about it. That reality continues whether we understand it or not. That the universe unfolds according to its own logic, not ours. There's something peaceful about recognizing our place in this vast cosmos, neither central nor special, but part of something magnificent beyond our comprehension. The continents will continue drifting whether we believe in plate tectonics or not. Bacteria will continue causing and preventing diseases whether we believe in germ theory or not. The quantum world will continue its strange dance whether we understand it or not. Truth doesn't need our permission to be true. So rest well, knowing that while we sleep, scientists around the world are working to expand human knowledge, some confirming existing theories, others challenging them. Some are probably proposing ideas right now that seem completely absurd, but will one day transform our understanding of everything. The great human conversation about the nature of reality continues, and we're all part of it, whether we're active scientists or simply curious minds wandering about the world. May your dreams be filled with revolutionary insights that seem absurd until they suddenly make perfect sense. May you wake tomorrow slightly more open to impossible possibilities than you were today. And may you remember that in the great story of human understanding, the most ridiculed ideas sometimes turn out to be the most profound truths. In the stillness of night, when the world softens and slows, remember that beneath the apparent quiet, continents are drifting, atoms are vibrating, neurons are firing, bacteria are thriving, and somewhere, someone is discovering a truth that will seem like madness until the day it seems like common sense. It's the kind of bedtime story only the history of science could write, where the heroes are often unrecognized, the victories often posthumous, but the truth always eventually magnificently prevails. Thank you for joining me on this gentle exploration of scientific vindication and human fallibility. If this journey through ridiculed ideas helped you see the world a bit differently, or filled you with wonder about what impossible truths we might be dismissing today, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd give the video a like and subscribe to continue our explorations of the mysteries that surround us. And if you're still awake and feeling contemplative, let me know in the comments what currently ridiculed idea you think might prove true in the future. This video has been for relaxation and education. It is not medical advice or a substitute for professional care. Always look after yourself and sleep well. Sweet dreams, and may you rest peacefully knowing that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than any of us can imagine, and that truth, however long it takes, however much resistance it faces, always finds a way to reveal itself to those patient enough to see it. May your dreams be soft, your thoughts be light, and your sleep come easy. Good night. Are these explanations held up to scrutiny? The breakthrough came through tragedy. Semmelweis's friend and colleague Jakob Kolechka was accidentally pricked by a student's scalpel during an autopsy. Within days, Kolechka developed symptoms remarkably similar to childbed fever and died. Semmelweis was struck by the similarity of the symptoms. Could it be that whatever killed his friend was the same thing killing the new mothers? And if so, could it be transmitted from corpses to living patients? The doctors and medical students routinely performed autopsies in the morning before making their rounds in the maternity ward. They would dissect the bodies of women who had died of childbed fever, examining the destroyed tissue, the infected organs, and then, without washing their hands, without changing their clothes, they would go directly to examine women in labour, reaching into birth canals with hands that had just been inside corpses. It's difficult for us to imagine now, in our era of surgical scrubs and latex gloves, but this was standard practice. There was no concept of germs, no understanding of infection transmission. The doctors might wipe their hands on a cloth, but that was more about removing visible blood than preventing disease. The very idea that invisible particles could carry death from one body to another seemed like medieval superstition, not modern medicine. Semmelweis instituted a new policy in May 1847. All doctors and students must wash their hands in chlorinated lime solution before examining patients. The solution was chosen because it eliminated the cadaverous odour that clung to hands after autopsy work. Semmelweis didn't know about bacteria. He thought he was removing cadaverous particles, but the effect was the same. The mortality rate in the first clinic plummeted immediately, dropping to rates comparable to or even better than the second clinic. You would think this would be cause for celebration. Hundreds of lives saved with such a simple intervention. But the reaction from the medical establishment was hostile, even vicious. Senior doctors were offended by the implication that they had been causing deaths. How dare this upstart Hungarian suggest that gentlemen's hands could be unclean? The very idea that doctors, educated men of good standing, needed to wash their hands like common labourers was insulting. There was also a deeper philosophical objection. The prevailing medical theory of the time attributed disease to imbalances in the body's humours or to environmental factors like bad air, called miasma. The idea that disease could be transmitted by particles too small to see contradicted the entire theoretical framework of medicine. It wasn't just wrong, it was incoherent within their understanding of how disease worked. Semmelweis's superior, Professor Johann Klein, was particularly opposed to the hand-washing protocol. He saw it as a criticism of his department and suggestion that his clinic had been negligent. When Semmelweis's assistant position ended in 1849, Klein refused to renew it. Semmelweis was forced to leave Vienna, returning to Hungary where he continued to advocate for hand-washing but with limited influence. The tragedy deepened as Semmelweis watched his discovery ignored while women continued to die. He wrote increasingly angry letters to prominent obstetricians across Europe, accusing them of being murderers for not adopting his hand-washing protocol. His tone became more strident, more desperate. He published a book, The Etiology, Concept and Prophylaxis of Childbed Fever, but it was largely ignored or criticised for its aggressive tone and confusing style. By the 1860s, Semmelweis's behaviour had become erratic. Whether from the frustration of being ignored or from an underlying mental illness, possibly Alzheimer's disease or neurosyphilis, his mental state deteriorated. His family, concerned about his increasingly bizarre behaviour, had him committed to an asylum in 1865. The conditions in the asylum were brutal. Within 2 weeks, Semmelweis was dead, ironically from an infection similar to the childbed fever he had fought to prevent, possibly caused by beatings from the guards. 20 years later, Louis Pasteur's germ theory would provide the scientific framework that explained why Semmelweis had been right. Joseph Lister would develop antiseptic surgical techniques based on germ theory. Robert Koch would establish the principles for proving that specific microorganisms cause specific diseases. The medical community would eventually accept what Semmelweis had demonstrated decades earlier, that clean hands save lives. But think about those intervening decades. Thousands upon thousands of women died unnecessarily because the medical establishment couldn't accept a simple truth that contradicted their preconceptions. Each of those deaths represents not just a statistic, but a human tragedy. A mother who never got to raise her children, a family destroyed by preventable loss. The cost of rejecting Semmelweis's discovery wasn't just measured in scientific progress delayed, but in human lives lost. There's something particularly poignant about ideas that could save lives being rejected. When we dismiss a new theory in physics or astronomy, the consequence might be that our understanding of the universe remains incomplete for a while longer. But when we dismiss a medical breakthrough, people die. Real people with families and dreams and futures that could have been saved if only we could overcome our attachment to being right, our resistance to admitting we've been wrong. Let's explore another medical breakthrough that faced fierce resistance, the use of anesthesia during surgery. Today, the idea of performing surgery without anesthesia seems barbaric, unthinkable. But in the 1840s, when ether and chloroform were first introduced as surgical anesthetics, many in the medical establishment opposed their use, and not just for medical reasons. Before anesthesia, surgery was a brutal affair. Patients were held down by strong assistants while surgeons worked as quickly as possible to minimize the duration of agony. The screams of patients echoed through hospital corridors. Surgical skill was measured not just by precision but by speed. The ability to complete an amputation in under 3 minutes was a mark of expertise. Some patients died from shock caused by the pain alone. When William Morton demonstrated the use of ether anesthesia at Massachusetts General Hospital in October 1846, it should have been recognized immediately as one of the greatest advances in medical history. A patient underwent surgery to remove a tumor from his neck without pain, remaining unconscious throughout the procedure. When he awoke, he reported feeling no pain during the operation. The age of painless surgery had arrived. But the resistance was immediate and came from unexpected quarters. Some doctors argued that pain during surgery was necessary, that it helped the body fight infection and promoted healing. They believed that the body's natural response to surgical trauma, including the pain response, was part of the healing process. To eliminate pain was to interfere with nature's design. Religious objections were even more vehement, particularly regarding the use of anesthesia during childbirth. Many clergy argued that the pain of childbirth was ordained by God as punishment for Eve's sin in the Garden of Eden. To use anesthesia during labour was to circumvent divine will, to avoid a punishment that women were meant to endure. Some went so far as to suggest that children born to mothers who used anesthesia during delivery would be somehow damaged or morally inferior. There were also concerns about the moral implications of unconsciousness itself. What happened to the soul when the mind was artificially suspended? Could demons enter an unconscious body? Would patients say or do inappropriate things while under the influence of ether? The loss of control, the vulnerability of unconsciousness, seemed to threaten not just physical but spiritual well-being. Even among those who accepted anesthesia in principle, there was resistance to its widespread use. Some surgeons prided themselves on their ability to operate quickly and saw anesthesia as an unnecessary complication that would slow down procedures. Others worried about the risks, and there were indeed risks. Dosing was imprecise, and some patients died from anesthetic overdose. But the alternative, the continuation of surgical torture, seems incomprehensibly cruel from our modern perspective. The acceptance of anesthesia was gradual and uneven. Queen Victoria's use of chloroform during the birth of Prince Leopold in 1853 helped legitimise obstetric anesthesia, at least in Britain. If the Queen could use anesthesia during childbirth without divine retribution, perhaps it was acceptable for ordinary women as well. But resistance continued in many places for years, even decades. What's particularly striking about the resistance to anesthesia is how it reveals the complex interplay between medical, religious and social beliefs in determining what treatments are considered acceptable. The relief of pain, something we now consider a fundamental right of patients, was once controversial, even considered immoral. The idea that suffering might be necessary, beneficial or divinely ordained seems alien to modern medical ethics, but it was a powerful force in shaping medical practice for centuries. This brings us to a broader pattern in the rejection of revolutionary ideas, the role of belief systems that extend beyond pure scientific reasoning. When a new idea challenges not just scientific understanding but also religious beliefs, social hierarchies, or economic interests, the resistance multiplies. The idea must overcome not just intellectual skepticism but emotional, spiritual, and financial opposition. Consider the case of evolution by natural selection. When Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he knew he was dropping a bomb on Victorian society. He had delayed publication for years, aware of the controversy his theory would cause. The idea that species evolved through natural processes rather than being created in their current forms challenged not just scientific understanding but the entire worldview of a deeply religious society. The resistance to evolution wasn't simply about the science, it was about what the theory implied for humanity's place in the universe. If humans evolved from earlier primates, if we were not specially created in God's image but were simply another product of natural processes, what did that mean for human dignity, for morality, for the soul? The famous exchange between Bishop Samuel Wilberforce and Thomas Huxley, where Wilberforce asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, wasn't really about the science. It was about the perceived threat to human exceptionalism. Even among scientists, there was resistance to natural selection as the mechanism of evolution. The idea that the incredible complexity and beauty of life could arise from random variation and differential survival seemed too simple, too mechanical, too devoid of purpose or direction. Many scientists who accepted that evolution occurred preferred to believe it was guided by some internal drive toward complexity or perfection, rather than the blind process Darwin described. It took decades for natural selection to be fully accepted as the primary mechanism of evolution. Even today, more than 160 years after Darwin's publication, evolution remains controversial in some circles, not because the evidence is lacking, the evidence is overwhelming, but because the implications remain troubling to certain worldviews. The pattern repeats. An idea that challenges deeply held beliefs faces resistance that goes beyond scientific skepticism. Let's turn now to the realm of physics, where some of the most revolutionary ideas of the 20th century faced initial ridicule and rejection. The story of continental drift, which we touched on earlier with Wegener, is part of a larger revolution in our understanding of Earth itself. But first, let's explore how our understanding of the cosmos changed, and how those changes were resisted. For over 1,000 years, the geocentric model of the universe, with Earth at the center and everything else revolving around it, was not just accepted but considered obvious. After all, we don't feel the Earth moving. The sun, moon and stars appear to circle around us. The evidence of our senses seems to confirm that we are stationary while the heavens move. More than that, the geocentric model fit perfectly with religious teachings that placed humanity at the center of God's creation. When Nicholas Copernicus proposed in the 16th century that Earth orbited the Sun, he was challenging not just astronomy but theology, philosophy and common sense. The idea seemed absurd. If Earth was moving, why didn't we feel it? Why didn't we fly off into space? Why didn't the wind constantly blow in one direction as Earth moved through it? The objections seemed reasonable, even scientific, based on the understanding of physics at the time. Galileo. Galileo's telescopic observations in the early 17th century provided evidence for the heliocentric model. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, proving that not everything orbited Earth. He observed the phases of Venus, which could only be explained if Venus orbited the Sun. But rather than being celebrated for these discoveries, Galileo faced the Inquisition. In 1633, he was forced to recant his support for the heliocentric model and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. The Catholic Church wouldn't officially accept that Earth orbits the Sun until 1822, nearly 200 years after Galileo's trial. Think about that timeline. For 2 centuries, one of the most powerful institutions in the world officially maintained that Earth was the center of the universe, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The idea was too threatening to the established order, both cosmic and social, to be acknowledged. But let's return to the story of Earth itself, to the revolution in understanding that began with Wegener's continental drift and culminated in the theory of plate tectonics. After Wegener's death in 1930, his theory of continental drift was largely dismissed and forgotten. Geology textbooks barely mentioned it except as an example of how wrong-headed speculation could lead scientists astray. The continents were fixed, permanent, unchanging. This was geological orthodoxy. But evidence kept accumulating that didn't fit the fixed continent model. In the 1950s, mapping of the ocean floor revealed vast underwater mountain ranges, the mid-ocean ridges, running like seams around the globe. These ridges were geologically active, with frequent earthquakes and volcanic activity. Why would there be mountain ranges in the middle of the ocean? And why were they so geologically active? In 1960, Harry Hess proposed the concept of seafloor spreading. He suggested that new ocean floor was being created at the mid-ocean ridges, pushing the continents apart. This would explain Wegener's observations about matching fossils and geological formations on different continents. But Hess himself called his idea geopoetry because he knew how radical it sounded. The ocean floor spreading? Continents being pushed around by the creation of new seafloor? It seemed fantastic. The key evidence came from studying the magnetic and magnetic properties of rocks on the ocean floor. When molten rock cools and solidifies, it preserves a record of Earth's magnetic field at that time. Scientists discovered that the ocean floor showed symmetrical patterns of magnetic reversals on either side of the mid-ocean ridges. This was exactly what you would expect if new rock was being created at the ridges and spreading outward, recording Earth's magnetic field as it periodically reversed over millions of years. By the late 1960s, the evidence for plate tectonics was overwhelming. The Earth's surface was indeed broken into large plates that moved, collided, separated, and slid past each other. Wegener had been right about continental drift. He just hadn't known the mechanism. The continents weren't ploughing through ocean floor like ships through water, as he had imagined. Instead, they were passengers on vast plates that included both continental and oceanic crust, driven by convection currents in the Earth's mantle. The acceptance of plate tectonics revolutionized geology. Suddenly, so many puzzling observations made sense. Why are there deep ocean trenches in some places and mountain ranges in others? Plates colliding and subducting. Why do earthquakes and volcanoes occur in specific patterns around the globe? They mark the boundaries between plates. Why do the Himalayas keep growing taller? India is still crashing into Asia, pushing the mountains up a few millimeters each year. But think about the scientists who had built their careers on the fixed continent model. Textbooks had to be rewritten. Entire theoretical frameworks had to be abandoned. Geologists who had dismissed Wegener as a crank had to acknowledge that the crank had been right all along. It's a humbling reminder that in science, as in life, certainty can be dangerous. The things we know for sure are sometimes the very things that blind us to new truths. Let's explore another fascinating case of scientific resistance, one that brings us into the microscopic world of disease, causing agents that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about infection. In the 1980s, a neurologist named Stanley Prusiner proposed something that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of biology, that infectious diseases could be caused by proteins alone, without any genetic material. Since the discovery of viruses and bacteria, it had been established that all infectious agents contained nucleic acids, either DNA or RNA. This genetic material was essential for reproduction. It was the blueprint that allowed pathogens to make copies of themselves and spread disease. The idea that a protein, without any genetic material whatsoever, could be infectious seemed impossible. It would be like saying a brick could build a house by itself without any blueprint or builder. Prusiner was studying a group of mysterious diseases that destroyed brain tissue, leaving it full of holes like a sponge. These diseases included scrapie in sheep, Creutzfeldt, Jakob disease in humans, and what would later be recognized as mad cow disease. They were clearly transmissible. You could infect one animal with tissue from another, but no one could find the infectious agent. There were no bacteria, no viruses, no fungi, nothing that fit the known categories of pathogens. After years of research, Prusiner proposed that these diseases were caused by what he called prions, proteinaceous infectious particles. These were misfolded proteins that could cause normal proteins to misfold in the same way, creating a cascade of misfolding that destroyed brain tissue. It was a radical idea that seemed to violate basic biological principles. How could a protein replicate without genetic material? How could it transmit information without DNA or RNA? The scientific community's reaction was harsh. Prusiner was ridiculed at conferences. His grant applications were rejected. Critics called his theory impossible, pointing out that it violated the central dogma of molecular biology, that information flows from nucleic acids to proteins, not the other way around. Some suggested he'd simply failed to find the real infectious agent, that there must be a virus or other conventional pathogen that he had missed. But Prusiner persisted, gathering more evidence. He showed that the infectious agent was resistant to treatments that destroyed nucleic acids, but was sensitive to treatments that destroyed proteins. He demonstrated that the protein alone, without any genetic material, could transmit disease. Slowly, grudgingly, the scientific community began to accept the possibility that prions were real. The implications were staggering. If proteins could be infectious, could transmit information and replicate without genetic material, it opened up entirely new possibilities for understanding disease. It also raised troubling questions about food safety. Mad cow disease, which devastated British cattle herds in the 1980s and 90s, was caused by prions. These proteins were remarkably stable, resistant to cooking temperatures that would destroy conventional pathogens. They could persist in the environment for years. In 1997, Prusiner was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for his discovery of prions. The scientific community had come to accept what had once seemed impossible. But the story doesn't end there. Prion research has continued to reveal surprises. Some scientists now believe that prion-like mechanisms might be involved in more common neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. The misfolding and aggregation of proteins might be a more general mechanism of disease than anyone imagined. There's something particularly unsettling about prions, isn't there? They challenge our understanding of what life is, what infection is, what information is. A protein that can transmit its shape to other proteins, causing disease and death, seems almost alien, like something from science fiction rather than science fact. Yet they're real, and they remind us that nature is often stranger than our imaginations, more creative than our theories allow. This brings us to another category of ridiculed ideas that prove true, those that revealed the existence of things we couldn't see or directly detect. The history of science is full of invisible entities that were first dismissed as fantasy before being accepted as reality. Atoms, germs, radiation, all were once considered absurd speculations by serious scientists. Consider the case of atoms themselves. The idea that matter was made of tiny indivisible particles went back to ancient Greek philosophers, but for most of scientific history it was considered unprovable speculation. In the early 1800s, John Dalton proposed his atomic theory based on careful observations of chemical reactions. He suggested that elements were made of identical atoms that combined in fixed ratios to form compounds. The resistance to atomic theory was significant. Many chemists preferred to work with observable quantities, weights and volumes, without speculating about invisible particles. They could describe chemical reactions perfectly well without invoking atoms. Why complicate things with unobservable entities? Some of the most prominent chemists of the 19th century remained skeptical of atoms well into the early 1900s. Even as evidence for atoms accumulated from Brownian motion to the periodic table, there were holdouts. Ernst Mach, a prominent physicist and philosopher, famously asked, "Have you ever seen one?" when discussing atoms. For Mach and others, science should deal only with observable phenomena. Atoms were a useful fiction perhaps, but not real entities. It wasn't until Einstein's work on Brownian motion in 1905 and Jean Perrin's experimental confirmation that the reality of atoms became undeniable. The random jiggling of pollen grains in water, first observed by Robert Brown in 1827, was caused by invisible water molecules bombarding the grains. By carefully measuring this motion, Perrin could calculate the size and number of molecules. Atoms were real, and we could count them. Think about the philosophical shift this represents. For centuries, maybe millennia, humans could only speculate about what matter was made of at its smallest scale. Then, suddenly, we could not only prove atoms existed, but measure them, count them, eventually even see them with scanning tunneling microscopes. The invisible became visible, the theoretical became practical, and all because some scientists refused to accept that we can't see it meant it doesn't exist. This pattern of revealing invisible realities extends to many revolutionary discoveries. When Marie and Pierre Curie began investigating radioactivity in the late 1800s, they were dealing with an invisible phenomenon that seemed to violate the principle of conservation of energy. How could certain rocks continuously emit energy without any apparent source? It seemed like perpetual motion, which was known to be impossible. The Curie's work was met with skepticism. Some scientists suggested they were measuring experimental errors. Others proposed that the energy came from some external source they hadn't identified. The idea that atoms could spontaneously decay, transforming into different elements while releasing energy, contradicted the belief that atoms were permanent, unchangeable, the fundamental building blocks of matter that had existed since the creation of the universe. Marie Curie faced additional resistance because she was a woman in a male-dominated field. When she was nominated for her first Nobel Prize, there was an attempt to exclude her and award it only to Pierre and Henri Becquerel. Pierre had to insist that Marie be included. Even after winning the Nobel Prize, she faced discrimination. When she was nominated to the French Academy of Sciences in 1911, she was rejected, likely because of her gender and the scandal surrounding her relationship with Paul Langevin after Pierre's death. But the Curie's work opened up an entirely new understanding of matter and energy. Radioactivity revealed that atoms weren't permanent and unchangeable, but could transform. It showed that matter and energy were more intimately connected than anyone had imagined, setting the stage for Einstein's E equals mc squared. It led to nuclear power, nuclear weapons, medical imaging, cancer treatment, and countless other applications. The story of radioactivity also illustrates how dangerous new discoveries can be when we don't fully understand them. The Curies and other early researchers handled radioactive materials with their bare hands, carried them in their pockets, marvelled at how they glowed in the dark. Marie Curie's laboratory notebooks are still too radioactive to handle safely. She died of aplastic anemia, likely caused by radiation exposure. The invisible rays that she spent her life studying ultimately killed her. There's a tragic irony in scientists being harmed by their own discoveries, isn't it? Semmelweis dying of the kind of infection he tried to prevent. Marie Curie killed by the radiation she revealed to the world. It's as if nature demands a price for its secrets. Though of course that's just our human tendency to see patterns and meaning where there might be only coincidence. Let's explore another invisible realm that revolutionized our understanding of disease, the world of germs. The germ theory of disease, which seems so obvious to us now, was revolutionary and controversial when first proposed. For most of human history, disease was attributed to bad air, imbalanced humours, divine punishment, or mysterious miasmas. The idea that tiny invisible organisms could cause disease seemed absurd. Even after Antony van Leeuwenhoek first observed bacteria under his microscope in the 1670s, calling them animalcules, no one connected these tiny creatures with disease. They were curiosities, interesting to observe, but surely too small to affect something as large as human body. How could something you couldn't see without a special instrument kill a grown man? It would be like suggesting that a speck of dust could topple a building. The connection between microorganisms and disease was made gradually through the work of many scientists, but faced resistance at every step. When Ignaz Semmelweis proposed that invisible particles cause childbed fever, he was ridiculed. When John Snow suggested that cholera was transmitted through contaminated water rather than bad air, he faced skepticism. The medical establishment had built elaborate theories around miasma and environmental causes of disease. To suggest that disease was caused by living organisms too small to see required abandoning these theories. Louis Pasteur's experiments in the 1860s provided compelling evidence for germ theory. He showed that microorganisms caused fermentation and spoilage. He demonstrated that life didn't spontaneously generate but came from existing life. He developed vaccines based on weakened pathogens. But even Pasteur faced resistance. The idea that disease was caused by invasion of the body by foreign organisms seemed too military, too mechanical. Where was the role of the patient's constitution, their moral character, their lifestyle? The medical establishment was particularly resistant because accepting germ theory meant acknowledging that many of their treatments were useless or even harmful. Bloodletting, purging, and other traditional treatments were based on the idea of rebalancing the body's humours. If disease was caused by germs, these treatments made no sense. Worse, they might weaken patients and make them more vulnerable to infection. Robert Koch's postulates, developed in the 1880s, provided a systematic way to prove that a specific microorganism caused a specific disease. You had to isolate the organism from sick individuals, grow it in pure culture, use it to cause disease in healthy animals, and then re-isolate it from those animals. This rigorous approach gradually convinced even skeptics that germs cause disease. But think about what accepting germ theory meant for everyday life. Suddenly the world was full of invisible enemies. Every surface might harbour deadly bacteria, every cough might spread disease, every handshake might be dangerous. It's a frightening worldview in some ways, this awareness that we're surrounded by invisible organisms that can kill us. No wonder people resisted it. No wonder they preferred to believe that disease came from bad air or divine displeasure, things that seem more controllable or at least more comprehensible. The acceptance of germ theory transformed not just medicine but society. It led to public health measures like sewage treatment and water purification. It changed personal hygiene habits. It revolutionized surgery. It saved millions of lives. But it also created new anxieties. new fears about contamination and infection that persist to this day. Every time you use hand sanitizer or worry about germs on a doorknob, you're living with the legacy of this once ridiculed idea. Now let's venture into the realm of physics again, to explore ideas that challenged our most basic intuitions about reality itself. In the early 20th century, physics underwent two revolutions that shattered common sense notions about space, time, matter, and energy. Both relativity and quantum mechanics were initially met with skepticism, even from brilliant physicists who couldn't accept their implications. Einstein's special relativity, published in 1905, suggested that time and space weren't fixed and absolute, but could stretch and compress depending on how fast you were moving. Time could run at different rates for different observers. Simultaneous events for one person might not be simultaneous for another. The faster you moved, the slower time passed for you relative to someone at rest. These ideas seem to contradict everything we experience in daily life. The resistance wasn't just from hidebound traditionalists. Some of the best physicists of the time struggled to accept relativity. Henri Poincaré, who had developed many of the mathematical tools Einstein used, never fully accepted the physical interpretation of relativity. Many physicists thought it was a mathematical trick that happened to give correct answers but didn't reflect physical reality. Part of the resistance came from the fact that relativity's effects are only noticeable at very high speeds, close to the speed of light. In everyday experience, time seems to flow at the same rate for everyone. The idea that your twin could age more slowly than you by travelling at high speed seemed like science fiction, not science fact. Yet experiments have confirmed this twin paradox using atomic clocks on fast-moving planes and satellites. General relativity, published in 1915, was even more radical. Einstein proposed that gravity wasn't a force, but a curvature of space-time caused by mass and energy. Massive objects like stars and planets warped the fabric of space-time, and this warping was what we experienced as gravity. Objects moved in straight lines through curved space-time, like marbles rolling on a curved surface. This was too much for many physicists. Even those who accepted special relativity balked at general relativity. It required advanced mathematics that most physicists of the time didn't understand. It made predictions that seemed impossible to test. And it replaced Newton's simple, intuitive picture of gravity as a force with something that seemed almost mystical, this bending of space and time itself. The turning point came in 1919 when Arthur Eddington's expedition observed the bending of starlight during a solar eclipse, exactly as Einstein's theory predicted. The measurements showed that light from distant stars was deflected as it passed near the sun, bent by the warping of space-time. Newton's theory predicted some deflection, but only half as much as Einstein's. The observations matched Einstein's prediction perfectly. Overnight, Einstein became a celebrity and general relativity went from fringe theory to accepted science. But even then, many physicists treated it as a mathematical curiosity with little practical relevance. Who cared if space and time were curved when the effects were so tiny in everyday life? It would take decades before the full implications of relativity were appreciated, before we understood that GPS satellites need relativistic corrections to maintain accuracy, that black holes were real, that the universe itself was expanding. Quantum mechanics faced even fiercer resistance, and not just from classical physicists, but from Einstein himself. The quantum world revealed by Planck, Bohr, Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and others was so alien to our everyday experience that even its creators struggled to accept what their equations were telling them. In the quantum realm, particles could be in multiple places at once until observed. The act of measurement seemed to determine reality. Particles could be entangled, instantly affecting each other regardless of distance. Einstein famously rejected the probabilistic nature of quantum mechanics with his quote, "God does not play dice with the universe." He spent the latter part of his career trying to find a more deterministic theory that would explain quantum phenomena without the inherent randomness. He proposed thought experiments to show that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be hidden variables that determined outcomes that only appeared random. The most famous of these was the EPR paradox, proposed by Einstein, Podolsky and Rosen in 1935. They showed that quantum mechanics predicted spooky action at a distance, where measuring one particle could instantly affect another particle, no matter how far apart they were. This seemed to violate relativity's prohibition on faster than light communication. Surely, Einstein argued, this showed that quantum mechanics was missing something. But experiments, particularly those by Alain Aspect in the 1980s, confirmed that quantum entanglement was real. Particles could indeed be connected in ways that defied classical intuition. The universe really was fundamentally probabilistic at the quantum level. Einstein had been wrong. His intuition about how reality should work had led him astray. Even genius can be blinded by preconceptions. What's particularly interesting about the resistance to quantum mechanics is that it came not from ignorance, but from deep understanding. The physicists who rejected quantum mechanics weren't stupid or stubborn. They were brilliant scientists who understood the implications all too well. Quantum mechanics didn't just challenge specific theories, it challenged the entire classical worldview. The idea that reality existed independently of observation, that causes preceded effects, that information couldn't travel faster than light. Even today, more than a century after its development, quantum mechanics remains deeply counterintuitive. We can use it to build lasers and computer chips, to understand chemistry and develop new materials, but we still argue about what it means. The various interpretations of quantum mechanics, Copenhagen, many worlds, pilot wave, are attempts to make sense of a theory that works perfectly but defies common sense. This brings us to a profound point about the nature of scientific truth and human understanding. Sometimes, reality doesn't care about our intuitions. The universe is under no obligation to make sense to us, to conform to our expectations based on everyday experience. The fact that something seems absurd doesn't make it false. The fact that we can't imagine how something could be true doesn't mean it isn't. Let's explore another category of ridiculed ideas, those that revealed hidden connections between seemingly unrelated phenomena. One of the most beautiful examples is the discovery that light, electricity, and magnetism were all aspects of the same fundamental force, electromagnetism. In the early 19th century, electricity and magnetism were considered completely separate phenomena. Electricity was about static charges and current flow. Magnetism was about lodestones and compass needles. Light was, well, light, whatever that was. The idea that these three distinct phenomena were related seemed absurd. It would be like saying that sound, taste, and temperature were all the same thing. Hans Christian Ørsted's discovery in 1820 that electric current could deflect a compass needle was met with skepticism. He was demonstrating the effect to students when he noticed the deflection. Many physicists initially thought it must be experimental error or some kind of trick. How could electricity affect a magnet? They were different forces entirely. Michael Faraday's experiments in the 1830s further revealed the connection between electricity and magnetism. He showed that moving magnets could generate electric current and that electric currents produced magnetic fields. But Faraday was largely self-taught and lacked mathematical sophistication. His ideas about lines of force and fields were dismissed by many mathematically trained physicists as vague pictorial thinking. It wasn't until James Clerk Maxwell developed his equations in the 1860s that the full unity of electromagnetism was revealed. Maxwell showed mathematically that electricity and magnetism were two aspects of the same phenomenon. More remarkably, his equations predicted the existence of electromagnetic waves that would travel at a specific speed, the speed of light. This suggested that light itself was an electromagnetic wave. The idea that light was an electromagnetic wave was revolutionary and controversial. Light had been studied for thousands of years. How could it suddenly turn out to be the same phenomenon as electricity and magnetism? Many physicists were skeptical. Where was the experimental evidence for these electromagnetic waves? How could something travel through empty space without a medium? Heinrich Hertz's experiments in the 1880s finally demonstrated the existence of electromagnetic waves, what we now call radio waves. He showed that these waves could be generated, transmitted, and received, that they behaved exactly as Maxwell's equations predicted. Light, electricity, magnetism, and now these new Hertzian waves were all manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon. Think about how this discovery transformed our world. Radio, television, cell phones, Wi-Fi, all depend on our understanding of electromagnetic waves. Medical imaging from X-rays to MRI uses different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. Our entire modern communication infrastructure is built on a connection between phenomena that were once thought to be completely unrelated. But there's another aspect to this story that's worth contemplating. Maxwell's equations were so mathematically beautiful, so elegant, that some physicists believed they must be true even before experimental confirmation. There was something about the way the equations unified different phenomena, the way they predicted new effects, that seemed too perfect to be wrong. This raises interesting questions about the role of mathematical beauty in physics. Can equations be so beautiful that they must be true? Or is this aesthetic sense itself a kind of prejudice that might lead us astray? Let's explore another realm where established beliefs were overturned, the understanding of our own minds and consciousness. For most of human history, mental illness was attributed to moral failings, demonic possession, or imbalances in bodily humours. The idea that mental illness had a biological basis in the brain was revolutionary and faced fierce resistance. In the 19th century, the notion that mental illness resulted from brain dysfunction was considered materialistic and dehumanizing. Many believed that the mind or soul was separate from the body and that mental disturbances were spiritual rather than physical problems. To suggest that conditions like depression, anxiety, or psychosis were brain diseases seemed to reduce humans to mere biological machines. The resistance wasn't just philosophical. If mental illness was a brain disease, what did that mean for free will and moral responsibility? Could someone be held accountable for actions taken while mentally ill? The legal and ethical implications were staggering. It was easier to believe that mental illness was a choice, a weakness, or a punishment than to accept it as a medical condition. Even as evidence accumulated that brain injuries could cause personality changes, that certain diseases affected behaviour, that mental illnesses ran in families suggesting genetic components, resistance persisted. The asylum system of the 19th and early 20th centuries often treated mental illness as something to be hidden away rather than treated medically. The development of effective psychiatric medications in the mid-20th century provided compelling evidence for the biological basis of mental illness. Chlorpromazine for schizophrenia, lithium for bipolar disorder, and later antidepressants showed that chemical interventions could dramatically improve mental health conditions. If mental illness was purely psychological or spiritual, how could pills help? But even today, stigma around mental illness persists. Many people still see depression as weakness rather than illness, anxiety as a character flaw rather than a medical condition. The idea that our thoughts, feelings, and behaviours are profoundly influenced by brain chemistry remains unsettling to many. It challenges our sense of self, our belief in free will, our understanding of what makes us human. There's something particularly poignant about the history of mental illness treatment. Countless people suffered needlessly because their conditions weren't recognised as medical problems. They were blamed, punished, isolated, subjected to cruel treatments, all because the biological basis of their suffering wasn't understood or accepted. The cost of rejecting new ideas isn't always measured in scientific progress delayed. Sometimes it's measured in human suffering prolonged. Now let's delve into one of the most dramatic examples of scientific vindication in recent history, the discovery that most stomach ulcers are caused by bacteria. We touched on Marshall and Warren earlier, but there's so much more to explore about how this discovery challenged medical orthodoxy and transformed treatment. For decades, medical students were taught that the stomach was essentially sterile. The acid in our stomachs, with a pH that could dissolve metal, was thought to be an absolute barrier to bacterial life. It was like teaching that nothing could live in a volcano. The stomach's acidic environment was one of the body's primary defences against infection. How could bacteria possibly survive there? The prevailing theory was that ulcers were caused by excess acid production triggered by stress, spicy food, and lifestyle factors. The treatment involved antacids, bland diets, stress reduction, and in severe cases, surgery to cut nerves that stimulated acid production. It was a multi-billion-dollar industry built on this understanding. Pharmaceutical companies made fortunes selling acid, blocking drugs. Surgeons built careers on ulcer operations. When Marshall and Warren first observed spiral, shaped bacteria in stomach biopsies from patients with gastritis and ulcers, they faced a fundamental problem of credibility. They were unknowns from Perth, Australia, far from the major medical centres of Europe and America. They were challenging not just a medical theory, but an entire treatment industry. Who were they to overturn decades of established medical practice? Their first attempts to culture the bacteria failed repeatedly. The standard culture time for bacteria was 48 hours, but Helicobacter pylori grew much more slowly. It was only when culture plates were accidentally left in the incubator over an Easter weekend that colonies finally appeared. Even this success was initially dismissed. Critics suggested they had contaminated their samples, that the bacteria were artifacts or commensals that didn't cause disease. Marshall's decision to experiment on himself was born of frustration. He had treated patients with antibiotics and seen their ulcers heal, but no one would believe him. So in July 1984, he drank a culture of Helicobacter pylori that had been isolated from a patient with gastritis. His colleagues thought he was crazy. His wife was furious, but he was determined to prove his point. Within days, Marshall developed nausea, vomiting, and bad breath. A biopsy showed that his stomach lining was inflamed and infected with the spiral bacteria. He had proven that Helicobacter pylori could colonize the stomach and cause disease. He then treated himself with antibiotics and his symptoms resolved. It was a perfect demonstration of Koch's postulates performed on himself. Even this dramatic demonstration didn't immediately convince the medical establishment. Some argued that Marshall's experiment only proved the bacteria could cause acute gastritis, not chronic ulcers. Others suggested that the bacteria might be present in ulcer patients, but not actually cause the ulcers. The resistance was partly scientific skepticism, but also economic and psychological. Accepting Marshall and Warren's discovery meant admitting that the medical profession had been wrong for decades, that patients had undergone unnecessary surgery, that billions had been spent on treatments that addressed symptoms rather than causes. The transformation was gradual. More studies confirmed the link between Helicobacter pylori and ulcers. Treatment trials showed that antibiotics could cure ulcers permanently, not just manage symptoms. By the mid-1990s, medical consensus had shifted. In 2005, Marshall and Warren received the Nobel Prize. Today, a condition that was once considered chronic and incurable can be eliminated with a 2-week course of antibiotics. But the story doesn't end there. Further research has revealed that Helicobacter pylori has a complex relationship with human health. While it can cause ulcers and stomach cancer, it might also protect against esophageal cancer and some allergic conditions. The bacteria has been with humans for at least 60,000 years, evolving alongside us. In our rush to eliminate it, we might be losing something beneficial. It's a reminder that in biology, as in all science, the full story is often more complex than it first appears. The Helicobacter story also illustrates how personal bias can affect scientific judgment. Many doctors had built their understanding of ulcers around their own experiences with stress. They could feel stress in their stomachs, that tight churning sensation. It made intuitive sense that stress caused ulcers. The idea that bacteria were responsible seemed to diminish the psychological aspects of the disease, to reduce a complex psychosomatic condition to a simple infection. This brings us to a broader pattern in the resistance to revolutionary ideas, the role of personal investment in existing theories. Scientists, like all humans, become attached to their ideas. They build careers on certain assumptions, publish papers based on particular frameworks, teach students specific theories. When someone comes along and says those theories are wrong, it's not just an intellectual challenge, but a threat to their professional identity and legacy. Consider the case of Ludwig Boltzmann and statistical mechanics. In the late 19th century, Boltzmann proposed that the properties of gases could be explained by the statistical behavior of atoms and molecules. Heat was molecular motion, pressure was molecular collisions, temperature was average kinetic energy. These ideas seem obvious now, but they were revolutionary and controversial at the time. Many physicists rejected Boltzmann's statistical approach. They preferred deterministic equations that gave exact answers, not probabilistic ones that dealt with averages and distributions. Some still doubted that atoms existed at all. Others accepted atoms but rejected the idea that macroscopic properties like temperature emerge from microscopic chaos. It seemed to undermine the orderly, predictable nature of physics. The criticism took its toll on Boltzmann. He suffered from depression, possibly bipolar disorder, exacerbated by the professional rejection he faced. His ideas were attacked not just as wrong, but as unscientific, as abandoning the precision of physics for the vagueness of statistics. In 1906, while on vacation, Boltzmann hanged himself. He was 62 years old. Within a few years of Boltzmann's death, his ideas were fully vindicated. Einstein's work on Brownian motion, Perron's experiments on molecular reality, the development of quantum mechanics, all confirmed that Boltzmann had been right. Statistical mechanics became a cornerstone of physics. The formula for entropy that Boltzmann derived, S equals K log W, is engraved on his tombstone. There's something deeply tragic about Boltzmann's story. He had the right ideas, but at the wrong time, before the experimental evidence was compelling enough to overcome theoretical prejudice. He faced not just scientific disagreement, but personal attacks on his competence and sanity. The stress of fighting for his ideas, of being dismissed and ridiculed, contributed to his mental illness and ultimate suicide. This pattern of personal destruction in the face of scientific rejection appears repeatedly in history. Semmelweis driven mad, Wegener dying in the Arctic still fighting for his theory, Boltzmann taking his own life. It's a reminder that science, for all its objectivity and rationality, is done by humans with human emotions, human weaknesses, human breaking points. The cost of being right too early isn't just professional, but personal, sometimes fatal. Let's explore another fascinating case where initial ridicule gave way to revolutionary understanding, the concept of extinction. Today we take for granted that species can go extinct, that the dinosaurs once ruled the Earth but are gone forever, that countless species have appeared and disappeared over geological time. But this idea was once considered impossible, even blasphemous. In the 18th century, the prevailing view was that God's creation was perfect and permanent. Every species that had ever existed still existed somewhere. If you found fossil bones of an unknown creature, it must still be alive in some unexplored part of the world. The idea that God would create a species only to let it die out suggested either divine imperfection or divine cruelty, both theologically unacceptable. Thomas Jefferson, among his many other accomplishments, was fascinated by paleontology. When he received fossil bones of what appeared to be a giant ground sloth, he was convinced the creature still lived somewhere in the unexplored American West. He instructed Lewis and Clark to look for living specimens during their expedition. The idea that the bones represented an extinct species was, to Jefferson, scientifically and philosophically untenable. Georges Cuvier, working in Paris in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, accumulated evidence that extinction was real. He studied elephant fossils and showed that mammoths were different from either African or Asian elephants, not just varieties but distinct species. He examined fossil after fossil that didn't match any living creature. The evidence was overwhelming, these animals no longer existed. But Cuvier faced fierce resistance. Critics argued that the fossil creatures must still exist in unexplored regions. The world was vast, much of it unknown to European science. Surely these animals lived in the deep ocean, in remote jungles in polar regions somewhere. To accept extinction meant accepting that creation was changeable, that species could disappear, that the world was fundamentally different in the past than it was in the present. Cuvier proposed catastrophism to explain extinction, the idea that periodic catastrophes wiped out species, after which new species were created. This preserved some role for divine intervention, while acknowledging the reality of extinction. But even this compromise was controversial. It suggested a chaotic, violent history of life rather than the smooth, ordered creation many believed in. The acceptance of extinction opened the door to evolutionary thinking. If species could disappear, perhaps they could also appear through natural processes rather than special creation. If the past was different from the present, perhaps species changed over time. Extinction was a crack in the edifice of fixed creation that would eventually bring the whole structure down. What's particularly interesting about the extinction debate is how it reveals the interconnection between scientific and religious beliefs. The resistance to extinction wasn't primarily about the fossil evidence, which was quite clear. It was about what extinction implied for the nature of creation, divine providence, and humanity's place in the world. Scientific ideas that challenge religious or philosophical frameworks face resistance beyond mere scientific skepticism. This pattern continues today with ideas that challenge deeply held beliefs about human nature, consciousness, free will, and our place in the universe. The resistance to ideas often has less to do with the quality of evidence than with the implications of accepting that evidence. We resist not just being wrong about facts, but having to revise our entire worldview. Let's venture into another realm where revolutionary ideas faced ridicule. The discovery that the Earth itself is ancient beyond human comprehension. For most of human history, people believed the Earth was young, perhaps a few thousand years old, certainly not more than tens of thousands. The idea that our planet was millions or billions of years old seemed not just wrong but absurd, contradicting both religious texts and common sense. James Hutton, a Scottish geologist working in the late 18th century, proposed something radical based on his observations of rock formations. He suggested that the processes shaping Earth today, erosion, sedimentation, volcanic activity, had been operating at the same rate throughout Earth's history. This principle, called uniformitarianism, implied that Earth must be incredibly ancient to account for all the geological features we observe. Hutton famously wrote that he could see no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end in the geological record. This was revolutionary and disturbing. If Earth's history stretched back indefinitely, where was the creation moment? How did this fit with biblical chronology that placed creation at 4004 BC? The implications were staggering and unacceptable to many. The resistance to deep time wasn't just religious, it was conceptual. Humans have trouble grasping very large numbers and very long timescales. 1,000,000 years is meaningless to our intuition. We can say the words, but we can't really comprehend the duration. It's like trying to visualize the distance to the nearest star or the number of atoms in a grain of sand. The numbers are too big for our minds to truly grasp. Charles Lyell, building on Hutton's work in the 19th century, provided more evidence for Earth's great age. He showed how geological features could be explained by slow, gradual processes operating over immense periods. A canyon carved by a river, mountains raised by gradual uplift, sediments deposited layer by layer over eons. But even scientific minds struggled with the implications. Lord Kelvin, one of the most respected physicists of the 19th century, calculated that Earth could be no more than 20 to 40 million years old based on how long it would take to cool from a molten state. His calculations were rigorous, his physics impeccable, but he didn't know about radioactivity, which provides Earth's internal heat. His authoritative pronouncement delayed acceptance of Earth's true age for decades. The discovery of radioactivity in the early 20th century revolutionized our understanding of Earth's age. Not only did radioactive decay explain why Earth hadn't cooled as Kelvin predicted, but it also provided a clock for measuring geological time. By measuring the ratio of radioactive elements to their decay products, scientists could determine when rocks formed. The numbers that emerged were staggering. Earth wasn't thousands of years old, or even millions, but billions. 4.5 billion years to be more precise. That's a span of time so vast that all of human history, all of human existence, is less than a blink in comparison. Recorded history is about 5,000 years. Modern humans have existed for about 300,000 years, but Earth has been here for 4.5 billion years. Think about what accepting Earth's true age means for our sense of importance and permanence. Mountains that seem eternal are actually temporary, rising and eroding over millions of years. Continents drift and collide on timescales that dwarf human civilization. Species appear and disappear like actors on a stage, each thinking they're the main character when they're really just bit players in a drama that started long before they arrived and will continue long after they're gone. This brings us to another conceptual revolution that faced ridicule: the idea that humans themselves are products of evolution rather than special creation. We touched on Darwin earlier, But let's explore more deeply why evolution by natural selection was so difficult to accept and why it remains controversial in some circles even today. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he carefully avoided discussing human evolution, ending with only the cryptic phrase that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. But everyone understood the implications. If animals evolved through natural selection, humans must have too. We weren't specially created in God's image, but were modified apes, products of the same blind process that created beetles and barnacles. The visceral rejection of human evolution went beyond religious objections. It challenged human exceptionalism, the belief that we're fundamentally different from other animals. We have language, culture, morality, consciousness, souls. How could these emerge from the same process that gave birds wings and fish fins? It seemed to reduce the spiritual to the material, the meaningful to the mechanical. The famous debate between Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford in 1860 illustrated the cultural divide. When Wilberforce mockingly asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, he was expressing the revulsion many felt at being connected to animals. When Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859, he carefully avoided discussing human evolution, ending with only the cryptic phrase that light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. But everyone understood the implications. If animals evolved through natural selection, humans must have too. We weren't specially created in God's image, but were modified apes, products of the same blind process that created beetles and barnacles. The visceral rejection of human evolution went beyond religious objections. It challenged human exceptionalism, the belief that we're fundamentally different from other animals. We have language, culture, morality, consciousness, souls. How could these emerge from the same process that gave birds wings and fish fins? It seemed to reduce the spiritual to the material, the meaningful to the mechanical. The famous debate between Thomas Huxley, Darwin's bulldog, and Bishop Samuel Wilberforce at Oxford in 1860 illustrated the cultural divide. When Wilberforce mockingly asked whether Huxley was descended from an ape on his grandfather's or grandmother's side, he was expressing the revulsion many felt at being connected to animals. Huxley's reported response, that he'd rather be descended from an ape than from a man who used his position to obscure truth, became legendary. But even among scientists who accepted evolution, natural selection as the mechanism was controversial. It seemed too random, too cruel, too purposeless. Many preferred to believe in directed evolution, guided by some internal drive toward complexity or perfection. The idea that all the beauty and complexity of life arose from random mutations and differential survival seemed to drain meaning from existence. Alfred Russel Wallace, who independently developed the theory of natural selection, eventually decided that human consciousness couldn't be explained by evolution alone. He turned to spiritualism, believing that human minds required supernatural explanation. Even the co-discoverer of natural selection couldn't fully accept its implications for humanity. The evidence for human evolution accumulated regardless of objections. Fossil discoveries revealed intermediate forms between apes and humans. Comparative anatomy showed our structural similarity to other primates. Embryology revealed that human embryos passed through stages resembling other animals. Molecular biology, unknown in Darwin's time, showed that we share most of our DNA with chimpanzees, confirming our close evolutionary relationship. Yet the resistance continues. Evolution remains controversial in many parts of the world, particularly human evolution. It's taught as just a theory or balanced with creation stories in some schools. The emotional resistance to being animals, products of evolution rather than special creation, runs deep in human psychology. We want to be more than modified apes, even if that's exactly what the evidence shows we are. There's something profoundly humbling about evolution, isn't there? It removes humans from the center of creation's purpose and makes us just one species among millions, here by chance rather than design. No wonder it faced such resistance. No wonder it still does. It asks us to reimagine our place in the universe, and that's never easy. Let's explore another domain where established wisdom was overturned, the circulation of blood in the human body. Today it seems obvious that blood circulates through vessels pumped by the heart, delivering oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. But for over 1,000 years, medical authorities believed something entirely different. The ancient Greek physician Galen, whose theories dominated medicine from the 2nd century until the Renaissance, taught that blood was produced in the liver from food, flowed to the organs where it was consumed, and had to be continuously replenished. The heart wasn't a pump, but a furnace that heated the blood and mixed it with vital spirits. Blood in arteries and veins was thought to be different substances with different functions. When William Harvey proposed in 1628 that blood circulated in a closed loop, pumped by the heart, returning to be recirculated rather than consumed, it contradicted everything physicians thought they knew. Harvey had done careful experiments, measuring the amount of blood the heart pumped, and showing it was far more than could be continuously produced and consumed. He traced the path of blood through the body, demonstrating valves in veins that ensured one-way flow. The medical establishment's reaction was hostile. Harvey was ridiculed as a circulator, a term that also meant quack or charlatan. His medical practice suffered as patients lost confidence in a doctor who held such radical views. Fellow physicians accused him of undermining the foundations of medicine. If Galen was wrong about circulation, what else might he be wrong about? The entire edifice of medical knowledge seemed threatened. Part of the resistance came from the inability to see the complete circuit. Harvey couldn't explain how blood got from arteries to veins because capillaries were too small to see without microscopes, which didn't yet exist. Critics seized on this gap, arguing that if Harvey couldn't show the complete path, his theory must be wrong. It would be like claiming rivers flowed in circles without being able to show where they connected. The implications of circulation went beyond anatomy. If blood circulated rather than being consumed, it changed ideas about nutrition, respiration, and disease. Traditional treatments like bloodletting, based on the idea of removing excess or corrupted blood, made less sense if blood was recirculated. The four humours theory, which had guided medicine for centuries, was called into question. Harvey lived to see his theory gradually accepted, unlike many revolutionary scientists. By the time he died in 1657, circulation was becoming established medical fact. The invention of the microscope allowed Marcello Malpighi to observe capillaries in 1661, completing Harvey's circuit. What had seemed impossible became undeniable when we could finally see it. The story of circulation illustrates how technological limitations can make correct theories seem wrong. Harvey was right, but he couldn't prove it completely with the tools available. How many other correct ideas have been dismissed because we couldn't yet see the evidence? How many truths are we rejecting today because our instruments aren't sensitive enough, our mathematics isn't sophisticated enough, our imaginations aren't flexible enough? This brings us to consider the role of technology in validating ridiculed ideas. The microscope revealed germs, validating germ theory. Telescopes showed moons orbiting Jupiter, supporting heliocentrism. Radioactive dating confirmed Earth's age. DNA sequencing proved evolutionary relationships. Often, the tools to prove revolutionary ideas don't exist when the ideas are first proposed. The visionaries who see truth before it can be proven face the harshest ridicule. Let's delve into a more recent revolution that's still ongoing, the understanding that many diseases have genetic causes. For most of medical history, diseases were attributed to environmental factors, infections, lifestyle choices, or moral failings. The idea that diseases could be inherited, written into our very blueprint, was slow to be accepted and remains incompletely understood. Gregor Mendel's work on inheritance in pea plants, published in 1866, laid the foundation for genetics, but his work was ignored for 35 years. The mathematical precision of inheritance patterns seemed too mechanical, too simple to explain the complexity of life. When his work was rediscovered in 1900, it revolutionized biology, but the medical implications took much longer to be recognized. The idea that diseases could be caused by defective genes seemed to remove human agency. If your genes determined your health, what was the point of living virtuously, eating well, exercising? It seemed to promote fatalism. Moreover, the early 20th century saw the dark side of genetic thinking in eugenics movements that used crude genetic ideas to justify racism, forced sterilization, and genocide. As molecular biology advanced in the mid-20th century, the genetic basis of many diseases became undeniable. Sickle cell anemia was shown to result from a single nucleotide change in the hemoglobin gene. Huntington's disease was traced to a repeated DNA sequence. Cystic fibrosis, muscular dystrophy, and hundreds of other conditions were linked to specific genetic mutations. But even as evidence accumulated, resistance persisted. Many conditions that clearly ran in families were attributed to shared environment or lifestyle rather than genes. Mental illnesses, despite obvious familial clustering, were blamed on bad parenting or trauma. Autism was attributed to refrigerator mothers who were emotionally cold to their children. Schizophrenia was blamed on dysfunctional family dynamics. The Human Genome Project, completed in 2003, promised to revolutionize medicine by identifying all human genes and their functions, but it also revealed how complex genetics really is. Most diseases aren't caused by single genes, but by multiple genes interacting with environmental factors. Genes that increase risk in one environment might be protective in another. The simple Mendelian inheritance that works for pea plants doesn't explain most human diseases. Today, we're still grappling with the implications of genetic medicine. Gene therapy promises to cure genetic diseases but raises ethical concerns. Genetic testing can reveal disease risks, but also creates anxiety and discrimination. The more we learn about genetics, the more complex the picture becomes. Genes aren't destiny but probability, not dictators but influences. The genetics revolution also illustrates how scientific revolutions can be incomplete or oversimplified. The initial idea that genes determine everything has given way to a more nuanced understanding of gene-environment interactions, epigenetics, and the microbiome's influence. Revolutionary ideas often start as oversimplifications that capture an important truth but miss complexity that's only revealed later. Speaking of the microbiome, let's explore one of the most recent revolutions in our understanding of human health, the discovery that the bacteria living in and on our bodies aren't just passengers, but active participants in our health. This idea would have seemed absurd just decades ago, but is now transforming medicine. For most of medical history after the acceptance of germ theory, bacteria were enemies to be eliminated. Antibiotics were miracle drugs that killed bacteria and saved lives. Antiseptic everything was the goal. The idea that we needed bacteria, that they were essential for our health, contradicted everything we thought we knew about hygiene and disease prevention. Early suggestions that gut bacteria might be important for health were dismissed as alternative medicine nonsense. Yogurt with live cultures was health food faddism. Probiotics were snake oil. Serious scientists didn't study beneficial bacteria, they studied pathogens. The idea that the bacteria in your intestines could affect your mood, your weight, your immune system seemed like New Age mysticism. But evidence accumulated that couldn't be ignored. Antibiotics, while life-saving, sometimes cause serious side effects beyond killing good bacteria, along with bad. C. Difficile infections, which occur when antibiotics disrupt normal gut bacteria, could be fatal. Inflammatory bowel diseases were associated with altered gut bacteria. Obesity patterns suggested microbial involvement. The development of DNA sequencing technology allowed scientists to identify and study bacteria that couldn't be cultured in laboratories. The results were staggering. Humans carry trillions of bacteria, outnumbering our own cells. These bacteria aren't just passive residents, but active partners, digesting food we can't digest, producing vitamins we need, training our immune systems, even producing neurotransmitters that affect our brains. The implications are still being worked out. Fecal transplants, the transfer of stool from healthy donors to sick patients, can cure C. difficile infections and might help with other conditions. The idea of putting someone else's feces into your body sounds revolting, but it works. Bacteria we once tried to eliminate are now being cultivated as medicine. The microbiome revolution is happening right now, in real time. We're discovering that many conditions we thought were purely genetic or environmental have microbial components. Autism, depression, autoimmune diseases, even some cancers might be influenced by our bacterial passengers. The simple picture of germs as enemies has given way to a complex ecosystem where balance matters more than sterility. This ongoing revolution illustrates how scientific understanding continues to evolve, how ideas once ridiculed become accepted and then refined. We're probably wrong about many things we're certain of today. Future generations will look back at our current medical practices with the same mixture of horror and amusement that we feel when reading about bloodletting and humoral theory. Let's explore another category of ridiculed ideas that proved true, those involving fundamental forces and particles that couldn't be directly observed. The history of physics is full of theoretical predictions that seemed absurd until experimental confirmation forced their acceptance. The neutrino provides a perfect example. In 1930, Wolfgang Pauli proposed the existence of a particle that had no electric charge, almost no mass, and barely interacted with matter. It was a desperate attempt to explain why energy seemed to disappear during radioactive decay. Even Pauli was embarrassed by his proposal, calling it a desperate remedy and betting a case of champagne that the particle would never be detected. The properties Pauli proposed for the neutrino seemed designed to make it undetectable. It could pass through the entire Earth without interacting with a single atom. Billions of neutrinos from the Sun pass through your body every second, and you never notice. How could such a particle exist? How could you ever prove it existed? It seemed like proposing invisible, intangible ghosts to explain experimental discrepancies. Many physicists dismissed the neutrino as a mathematical trick, a bookkeeping device to balance equations rather than a real particle. Detecting it would require enormous detectors and incredible patience. Waiting for the rare interaction between a neutrino and matter, it seemed impossible, like trying to catch shadows with a net. But Clyde Cowan and Frederick Rains managed to detect neutrinos in 1956, 26 years after Pauli's proposal. They used a nuclear reactor as a source and tons of detection equipment to catch the faint signals of neutrino interactions. Pauli, informed by telegram, reportedly interrupted a lecture to announce everything comes to him who knows how to wait. The confirmation of neutrinos opened up entirely new fields of physics and astronomy. Neutrino detectors have revealed the fusion processes in the Sun's core, detected supernovas in distant galaxies, and suggested that neutrinos have mass, contrary to original theories. These ghostly particles that seemed impossible to detect are now essential tools for understanding the universe. The neutrino story illustrates the importance of taking theoretical predictions seriously, even when they seem absurd. Mathematics has an uncanny ability to reveal truths about nature that our intuition would never discover. When equations predict something strange, it's worth looking for it, even if it takes decades and enormous effort to find. Another example of mathematical prediction preceding observation is antimatter. Paul Dirac's equation for the electron, developed in 1928, had an embarrassing feature. It predicted particles with negative energy. Dirac initially tried to explain this away, but eventually proposed that these solutions represented anti-electrons, particles identical to electrons but with opposite charge. Let's start with the basics. When we think about impossible technologies, we might imagine flying cars or time machines, those staples of science fiction that remain tantalizingly out of reach. But tonight's story is different. We're talking about technologies that are so woven into the fabric of your daily life that their absence would feel like losing a piece of yourself. Technologies that prestigious scientists, renowned engineers, and celebrated intellectuals declared would never, could never, should never work. But hold that thought gently because, as it turns out, being wrong about the future is perhaps humanity's most consistent talent. And there's something deeply comforting about that. It reminds us that expertise has limits, that the impossible is often just the possible waiting for someone stubborn enough to ignore the experts, and that the future is always stranger and more wonderful than even our brightest minds can imagine. Our journey begins, as many good stories do, with someone being spectacularly, confidently wrong. The year was 1899, and Charles H. Dewell, the commissioner of the US Patent Office, allegedly declared that the Patent Office might as well close because, quote, everything that can be invented has been invented. Now, historians debate whether Dewell actually said this, but the sentiment certainly existed at the turn of the 20th century. Many educated people genuinely believed humanity had reached the pinnacle of technological achievement. Think about that for a moment. In 1899, there were no airplanes, no antibiotics, no computers, no internet, no smartphones. Radio was in its infancy. Television didn't exist. The electron had only just been discovered, and yet learned individuals looked at the world of horse-drawn carriages and gas lamps and thought, yes, this is it, we've peaked. It's a bit like standing at the shore of a vast ocean and declaring you've seen all the water there is because you can see the horizon. The hubris is almost charming in its innocence, but this pattern, this confident declaration that we've reached the limits of the possible, repeats throughout history with an almost musical regularity. Let's delve deeper into one of the most famous examples of expertise meeting its match in persistent innovation. The story of powered flight is particularly delicious in its irony. In 1903, just months before the Wright brothers' successful flight at Kitty Hawk, the New York Times published an article suggesting that human flight might be possible in, and I quote, 1 million to 10 million years. Simon Newcomb, a respected astronomer and mathematician, had done the calculations. He proved with mathematical certainty that powered flight was impossible. His reasoning was elegant and seemed unassailable. He calculated the power-to-weight ratios, examined the strength of available materials, considered the limitations of engines, and concluded that no combination of known technologies could possibly lift a machine and its pilot into sustainable flight. Lord Kelvin, one of the most celebrated physicists of his era, a man whose contributions to thermodynamics were revolutionary, declared in 1895 that heavier-than-air flying machines were impossible. Not unlikely, not challenging, impossible. This wasn't some random skeptic. This was Lord Kelvin, the man who helped establish the absolute temperature scale, telling the world that airplanes couldn't exist. Meanwhile, in a bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, two brothers who had never finished high school were building a wind tunnel in the back room. Wilbur and Orville Wright didn't have prestigious degrees or mathematical proofs of possibility. What they had was an obsession with solving one problem at a time, a willingness to test rather than theorize, and perhaps most importantly, they hadn't read all the expert opinions explaining why their dream was impossible. Here's where things get interesting. The Wright brothers weren't the only ones trying to fly. They weren't even the best funded or most educated. Samuel Langley, secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, had a $50,000 grant from the War Department, a team of assistants, and the backing of the scientific establishment. His attempts at flight, including a spectacular failure just 9 days before the Wright brothers' success, seemed to confirm what the experts already knew: powered flight was a fool's errand. But there's so much more to explore about this remarkable moment in history. The Wright brothers' success wasn't just about proving the experts wrong, it was about approaching the problem from an entirely different angle. While Langley focused on power, building bigger and bigger engines, the Wrights focused on control. They realized that the challenge wasn't just getting into the air, it was staying there and being able to direct your path once airborne. They spent years flying gliders, feeling the air currents with their bodies, developing an intuitive understanding of flight that no amount of theoretical calculation could provide. They invented the wind tunnel to test their theories. They developed new methods for controlling aircraft that are still fundamental to aviation today. And when they finally flew on December 17th, 1903, the world barely noticed. In fact, many newspapers didn't report the flight at all. Those that did often got the details wrong or treated it as a minor curiosity. The Scientific American, a publication dedicated to technological advancement, didn't report on the Wright brothers' flights until 1906. Even seeing wasn't necessarily believing. When the Wrights demonstrated their airplane in Europe in 1908, some spectators insisted it must be an elaborate hoax. This brings us to an even more fascinating question. Why are we so bad at recognizing revolutionary technologies when they first appear? Part of the answer lies in how our brains process the new and unexpected. When something challenges our fundamental assumptions about the world, our first instinct isn't to embrace it but to reject it. It's as though our mental models of reality have a kind of immune system that attacks ideas that don't fit. Think of it as intellectual inertia. Once we've built a mental framework for understanding the world, changing that framework requires enormous effort. It's easier, more comfortable to dismiss the anomaly than to rebuild our entire understanding. This is why the most revolutionary technologies often come from outsiders. people who haven't fully absorbed the conventional wisdom about what's impossible. Speaking of revolutionary technologies that face near universal skepticism, let's turn our attention to something you're using right this very moment to watch this video: the internet. Yes, that global network that has transformed human civilization more profoundly than perhaps any invention, since the printing press was once dismissed as a toy, a fad, a solution in search of a problem. In 1995, Robert Metcalfe, the inventor of Ethernet and founder of 3Com, predicted that the internet would, quote, catastrophically collapse in 1996. He was so confident in this prediction that he promised to eat his words if he was wrong. To his credit, when 1996 came and went without collapse, he literally blended a copy of his prediction with water and drank it at a conference. But Metcalfe wasn't alone in his skepticism. Clifford Stoll, an astronomer and computer expert, wrote in a 1995 Newsweek article titled "Why the Web Won't Be Nirvana" that, quote, "No online database will replace your daily newspaper, no CD-ROM can take the place of a competent teacher, and no computer network will change the way government works." He went on to mock the very idea of online shopping, asking who would want to buy books or airline tickets on a computer. Even more remarkably, in 1998, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, predicted that by 2005 it would become clear that the internet's impact on the economy had been no greater than the fax machines. He reasoned that most people have nothing to say to each other, and that the growth of the internet would slow drastically as this became apparent. It's easy to laugh at these predictions now, as you stream this video over the internet, perhaps while checking social media on another device, with your smart home adjusting the temperature based on data from the cloud. But these weren't random contrarians making wild guesses. These were experts in technology and economics, people who understood computers and networks better than 99% of the population at the time. Their mistake wasn't in their expertise, but in their imagination. They saw the internet as it was in 1995. Slow, unreliable, difficult to use, limited in content, and couldn't envision how it would evolve. They couldn't imagine Wikipedia replacing encyclopedias, Netflix replacing video stores, or smartphones putting the entire internet in everyone's pocket. This pattern of expert skepticism extends to virtually every transformative technology. Let's take a closer look at television, that glowing box that dominated living rooms for decades before the internet came along. In 1926, Lee De Forest, the inventor of the audion tube that made radio broadcasting possible, declared that television was, quote, a physical impossibility that could never work. The New York Times, in 1939, suggested that television was a novelty that would never seriously compete with radio because, quote, people must sit and keep their eyes glued on a screen. The average American family hasn't time for it. Darryl Zanuck, head of 20th Century Fox, proclaimed in 1946 that television wouldn't last because, quote, people will soon get tired of staring at a plywood box every night. Even when television began to succeed, experts continued to predict its demise. In the 1950s, as TV sets appeared in more and more homes, critics declared it a fad that would pass once the novelty wore off. They couldn't imagine that people would reorganize their entire lives around television schedules, that TV would become the dominant cultural force of the 20th century, that entire industries would rise and fall based on 30-second commercials broadcast between programs. But wait, there's more. The telephone, that device so fundamental to human communication that its absence would cripple modern society, was perhaps the most thoroughly rejected of all revolutionary technologies. When Alexander Graham Bell tried to sell his patent to Western Union in 1876, the company's internal memo dismissing the offer is a masterpiece of short-sighted thinking. William Orton, president of Western Union, called the telephone an electrical toy. The company's committee concluded that the telephone had too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. They couldn't see any commercial value in allowing people to talk to each other over wires. This was Western Union, the company that dominated long-distance communication through telegraphs, and they couldn't envision why anyone would want to hear a voice instead of receiving a written message. Even after the telephone began to spread, experts continued to doubt its utility. The chief engineer of the British Post Office, Sir William Preece, declared in 1878 that the telephone might be useful in America, but was unnecessary in Britain because, quote, "we have plenty of messenger boys." The mayor of a major American city in the 1880s worried about the environmental impact of telephone poles, predicting they would block out the sun if the technology continued to spread. Here's where our story takes a particularly delicious turn. Many of the technologies that faced the strongest skepticism did so precisely because they solved problems people didn't know they had. Before the telephone, people managed perfectly well with letters and telegrams. Before television, radio and newspapers seemed to provide all the information and entertainment anyone could want. Before the internet, libraries and encyclopedias appeared to contain all human knowledge worth accessing. This brings us to a profound insight about human nature and technological progress. We are remarkably good at adapting to our current circumstances, at convincing ourselves that the way things are is the way they must be. It's only after a new technology shows us a different possibility that we realise how constrained we were. It's like a fish not knowing it's wet until it experiences air for the first time. Let's examine another technology that faced waves of expert rejection, the automobile. At the turn of the 20th century, when automobiles were noisy, unreliable contraptions that frightened horses and broke down every few miles, the president of Michigan Savings Bank advised Henry Ford's lawyer not to invest in the Ford Motor Company. His reasoning was impeccable. "The horse is here to stay," he declared, "but the automobile is only a novelty, a fad." The Literary Digest, in 1899, suggested that the automobile would never, of course, come into as common use as the bicycle. Experts pointed to numerous insurmountable problems. Where would people get gasoline? The fuel was only available at drugstores in small quantities. Who would maintain these complex machines? There were almost no mechanics who understood internal combustion engines. How would people learn to drive? The skills required seemed beyond the average person. Roads, built for horses and carriages, would surely be destroyed by heavy automobiles. The noise would make city life unbearable. The speed, sometimes reaching a terrifying 20 miles per hour, would cause countless accidents. The pollution from engines would poison the air. Every practical consideration seemed to argue against the automobile's adoption. And yet, within 2 decades, the automobile had transformed American society. Cities redesigned themselves around cars. Suburbs bloomed as commuting became possible. Industries from oil to rubber to glass reorganized to support automobile manufacturing. The very geography of nations changed as highways connected distant places. The experts had been right about the problems, but wrong about humanity's ability to solve them. This pattern repeats with stunning consistency. The radio was dismissed as a fad that would never compete with newspapers. Marconi, the inventor of radio, was told by colleagues that his idea of transmitting voices through the air was idiotic. When he proposed that radio waves could cross the Atlantic, experts calculated that it would require an antenna 500 miles high. They were wrong about that too. The phonograph faced similar skepticism. Thomas Edison, its inventor, initially saw it primarily as a business device for recording dictation. The idea that people would want to listen to recorded music in their homes seemed absurd. Why would anyone pay for a recording when they could hear live music? Critics worried that recorded music would kill the live music industry, that musicians would lose their livelihoods, that the art of performance would die. Instead, recorded music created entirely new art forms, new industries, new ways of experiencing and sharing human creativity. It democratized music, allowing people in small towns to hear the world's greatest orchestras, enabling new genres to spread across continents, preserving performances that would otherwise have vanished into memory. The phonograph didn't kill music, it multiplied it infinitely. Even technologies we now consider quaint-faced fierce resistance. The umbrella was mocked as effeminate when first introduced in England. Jonas Hanway, who popularised the umbrella in London in the 1750s, was pelted with rubbish by coach drivers who saw it as a threat to their business of ferrying people through the rain. Coffee was banned in various places as a dangerous drug that would corrupt the youth. The fork was condemned by the church as an affront to God's design, since God had given us fingers to eat with. But let's delve deeper into a more recent example that illustrates how even in our supposedly enlightened age, we still struggle to recognize transformative technologies. The personal computer, the device that launched the information age, was thoroughly dismissed by the very people who should have recognized its potential. In 1943, Thomas Watson, chairman of IBM, allegedly said, "I think there is a world market for maybe 5 computers." While historians debate whether Watson actually said this, the sentiment was widespread. Computers were seen as gigantic, expensive machines, useful only for specialized calculations in large corporations or government agencies. The idea that individuals would want computers in their homes seemed as absurd as suggesting everyone needed their own printing press. Ken Olsen, founder of Digital Equipment Corporation, a major computer company, said in 1977, "There is no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. This wasn't ancient history. This was the year Star Wars came out, when the modern world was clearly emerging, and the founder of a computer company couldn't see why anyone would want a personal computer." Even after personal computers began selling, experts continued to underestimate their importance. In 1981, Bill Gates allegedly said that 640 kilobytes of memory ought to be enough for anybody. Whether he actually said this is disputed, but the belief that computer memory requirements would remain modest was common. People couldn't envision storing photos, videos, music, and entire libraries on their computers because those applications hadn't been invented yet. The mobile phone faced similar skepticism. In 1981, Marty Cooper, the inventor of the cell phone, was told by experts at Atent that mobile phones would never be a mass-market item. Their research showed that people didn't want to be reachable all the time. The phones were too expensive, too large, too battery-hungry. The infrastructure required seemed impossibly complex and costly. McKinsey & Company, one of the world's most prestigious consulting firms, advised Atent in 1980 that the total world market for mobile phones would max out at 900,000 units. Not 900,000 per year, 900,000 total. Ever. They based this on careful analysis of costs, infrastructure requirements, and consumer behavior. Today, more people have mobile phones than have access to clean drinking water. The technology that experts said would appeal to only a tiny elite has become so essential that losing your phone can feel like losing a part of yourself. In many developing nations, people skipped landlines entirely, going straight from no phones to mobile phones, leapfrogging a century of telecommunications infrastructure. Here's where things get even more interesting. The smartphone, the device that may be within arm's reach of you right now, faced skepticism even from leaders in the mobile phone industry. When Apple announced the iPhone in 2007, Steve Ballmer, CEO of Microsoft, laughed at it. $500 for a phone, he scoffed. It doesn't have a keyboard, which makes it not a very good email machine. BlackBerry's co-CEO, Jim Balsillie, was equally dismissive. He insisted that consumers would never give up physical keyboards for touchscreens. Nokia, which dominated the mobile phone market, saw no threat from Apple's entry. They had decades of experience making phones. What did a computer company know about telecommunications? Within a decade, BlackBerry was essentially extinct. Nokia's phone business had been sold off, and Microsoft had exited the mobile phone market entirely. The iPhone and its Android competitors didn't just change the phone industry, they changed human behavior on a global scale. They put the internet, cameras, music, maps, games, and thousands of apps in billions of pockets. They transformed how we communicate, navigate, learn, shop, and entertain ourselves. The smartphone's success illustrates another crucial pattern in technological adoption. Revolutionary technologies often succeed not by doing old things better, but by enabling entirely new behaviors. The iPhone wasn't just a better phone, it was a platform for possibilities that didn't exist before. Apps like Instagram, Uber, and TikTok couldn't have been imagined before smartphones made them possible. This brings us to an even deeper question. Why do we keep making the same mistake? Why, despite centuries of being proven wrong, do experts continue to dismiss transformative technologies? Part of the answer lies in the nature of expertise itself. Becoming an expert requires deep immersion in existing paradigms. You can't push the boundaries of knowledge without first understanding where those boundaries are. But this same immersion can create blind spots. Think of it as a kind of professional paradox. The more you know about how things work, the harder it becomes to imagine them working differently. The expert in horse breeding couldn't see the automobile coming. The telegraph operator couldn't envision the telephone. The radio engineer couldn't imagine television. The computer scientist building mainframes couldn't conceive of personal computers. There's something deeply human about this limitation. Our brains are prediction machines, constantly using past experience to anticipate the future. This works wonderfully for navigating familiar situations, but fails spectacularly when confronted with genuine novelty. We're like drivers navigating by looking in the rearview mirror, assuming the road ahead will resemble the road behind. Let's take a closer look at a technology that's currently facing the same skepticism once directed at the internet and smartphones. Artificial intelligence, particularly large language models like the one helping to create this very narrative, is experiencing the familiar cycle of expert dismissal and revolutionary potential. Distinguished computer scientists argue that these systems are merely sophisticated pattern matching, incapable of true understanding or creativity. Others warn of existential risks, echoing the fears that accompanied every transformative technology. Critics point out the limitations, the errors, the energy consumption, the potential for misuse. All valid concerns, just as the critics of automobiles were right about pollution and accidents, the critics of television were right about its potential for manipulation, and the critics of the internet were right about privacy concerns. But focusing only on the problems blinds us to the transformative potential. Consider virtual reality, another technology experiencing the familiar pattern of hype, disappointment, and skepticism. Experts have declared VR dead multiple times over the past 30 years. Too expensive, too nauseating, too isolating, too limited in application. Yet each time it's been declared dead, someone finds a new approach, solves another problem, opens another possibility. The pattern extends to biotechnology, renewable energy, space exploration, quantum computing. In each field, breakthroughs that seemed impossible become inevitable in hindsight. The cure for diseases, the harnessing of fusion power, the colonization of other planets, these may seem like fantasies today, just as flying across the ocean or talking to someone on the other side of the world once did. But there's so much more to explore about why we're so consistently wrong about the future. One fascinating aspect is the role of compound innovation. Revolutionary technologies rarely arrive fully formed. Instead, they build on countless smaller innovations, each seemingly insignificant on its own. The smartphone required advances in battery technology, display screens, miniaturization, wireless communication, software development, and dozens of other fields. This compound nature of innovation makes prediction nearly impossible. You can't foresee the smartphone by looking at any single component technology. It's like trying to predict a symphony by listening to individual instruments warming up. The magic happens in the combination, in ways that surprise even the inventors themselves. Another factor is the social nature of technological adoption. Technologies don't succeed or fail based solely on their technical merits. They succeed when they fit into human lives in ways that feel natural and necessary. The telephone succeeded not because it was technically superior to the telegraph, but because talking felt more natural than encoding messages in dots and dashes. Consider social media, a technology that didn't exist 20 years ago, but now shapes global politics, economics, and culture. Early social networks like Friendster and MySpace were dismissed as teenage fads. Serious people didn't waste time updating their status or sharing photos online. The idea that presidents would announce policies on Twitter or that revolutions would be organized on Facebook seemed absurd. Yet social media succeeded by tapping into fundamental human needs for connection, validation, and self-expression. It turned out that people had quite a lot to say to each other, contrary to Paul Krugman's prediction about the internet. The technology created new forms of human behavior that couldn't have been predicted from previous communication patterns. This unpredictability of human behavior around new technologies adds another layer of complexity to prediction. When the telephone was invented, nobody predicted teenagers would spend hours talking to friends they'd just seen at school. When television arrived, nobody foresaw binge-watching or the rise of celebrity culture. When the internet emerged, nobody anticipated memes, viral videos, or online dating. Let's examine another category of dismissed technologies, those in the medical field. The history of medical innovation is littered with breakthroughs that were rejected by the establishment. Ignaz Semmelweis, who discovered that handwashing dramatically reduced deaths in maternity wards, was ridiculed by the medical establishment and driven to madness by their refusal to accept his findings. The idea that tiny invisible organisms could cause disease seemed absurd to 19th century doctors. Gentlemen's hands were clean by definition. The suggestion that doctors were killing patients by not washing their hands was insulting. It took decades and countless unnecessary deaths before germ theory became accepted medical practice. Similarly, the discovery of antibiotics faced skepticism. When Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin in 1928, he struggled to interest anyone in its potential. It was only during World War II, when the need for infection-fighting drugs became desperate, that penicillin's development was properly funded. The drug that would save hundreds of millions of lives almost went undeveloped because experts couldn't see its importance. Vaccination faced even fiercer resistance. Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine was denounced as ungodly, dangerous, and ineffective. Cartoons showed vaccinated people sprouting cow parts. Religious leaders declared it a violation of divine will. Even after vaccination proved effective, resistance continued for decades. Some of the same arguments used against vaccines in the 1700s are still heard today. The X-ray, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, was initially dismissed as an elaborate hoax. Lord Kelvin, the same physicist who declared powered flight impossible, pronounced X-rays a fraud. Newspapers mocked the idea of seeing through solid objects. When Röntgen demonstrated his discovery, showing the bones in his wife's hand, she reportedly exclaimed, "I have seen my death." Even technologies that seem obviously beneficial faced resistance. Anesthesia was opposed by some religious leaders who believed pain in childbirth was divinely ordained. The stethoscope was mocked as unnecessary when doctors could simply place their ear on a patient's chest. Antiseptic surgery was resisted by surgeons who took pride in their blood-stained operating coats. This pattern in medical innovation reveals something profound about human psychology. We don't just resist new technologies, we resist new ways of understanding ourselves and our world. Each medical breakthrough required not just a technical innovation, but a fundamental shift in how we think about health, disease, and the human body. The same pattern appears in our understanding of the cosmos. When Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter and saw moons orbiting another planet, he shattered the geocentric worldview that had dominated for millennia. The Catholic Church condemned his observations not because they doubted what he saw, but because accepting them required reimagining humanity's place in the universe. Alfred Wegener's theory of continental drift, proposed in 1912, was ridiculed by geologists for decades. The idea that continents moved seemed absurd. What force could possibly move such massive objects? It wasn't until the 1960s, with the discovery of seafloor spreading and plate tectonics, that Wegener's crazy idea became accepted science. Even Einstein's theories faced skepticism. Many physicists initially rejected relativity as too radical, too abstract, too removed from common sense. The idea that time and space were flexible, that mass and energy were interchangeable, seemed more like philosophy than physics. Nobel laureate Philipp Lenard led a campaign against Einstein's Jewish physics, claiming it was inferior to German physics based on classical mechanics. This brings us to a crucial insight about innovation and human nature. Every transformative technology requires us to update our mental models of the world. The greater the transformation, the more painful the update. It's not just about accepting a new device or technique. It's about letting go of deeply held beliefs about what's possible, what's natural, what's right. Consider renewable energy, a field where skepticism continues despite mounting evidence of viability. For decades, experts declared that solar and wind power could never compete with fossil fuels. Too expensive, too intermittent, too dependent on subsidies. The idea of running industrial societies on sunshine and breezes seemed like hippie fantasy. Yet the cost of solar power has dropped by 99% over the past 40 years. Wind turbines now generate electricity more cheaply than coal plants in many markets. Countries like Costa Rica run on nearly 100% renewable electricity for months at a time. The transformation experts said was impossible is happening before our eyes. Electric vehicles faced similar dismissal. They were toys for rich environmentalists, critics said. The batteries were too expensive, too heavy, too slow to charge. The infrastructure didn't exist. Real Americans would never give up the roar of a gasoline engine. Major auto manufacturers insisted that electric vehicles would remain a tiny niche market. Then Tesla proved that electric cars could be fast, sexy, and practical. Other manufacturers scrambled to catch up. Governments began mandating phase-outs of gasoline vehicles. Charging networks sprouted across highways. The transformation of transportation that seemed impossible a decade ago now seems inevitable. But let's delve even deeper into the psychology of technological resistance. There's a fascinating phenomenon called the Semmelweis reflex, named after the hand-washing doctor, which describes the tendency to reject new evidence that contradicts established beliefs. It's not simple stubbornness, it's a fundamental feature of how our brains maintain coherent worldviews. When confronted with evidence that challenges our beliefs, we experience cognitive dissonance, a deeply uncomfortable feeling. The easiest way to resolve this discomfort isn't to change our beliefs, but to reject the evidence. We look for flaws in the methodology, question the motives of the messenger, or simply ignore information that doesn't fit our existing framework. This psychological tendency is amplified by social and professional pressures. Experts who've built careers on certain assumptions face not just intellectual but economic threats from revolutionary technologies. The telegraph operator had invested years learning Morse code. The film photographer had mastered chemical processes. The video store owner had built a business model. Accepting that their expertise might become obsolete required extraordinary psychological flexibility. There's also the problem of incremental versus revolutionary change. Experts are generally good at predicting incremental improvements. They can foresee faster processors, more efficient engines, stronger materials. What they struggle with is phase changes, moments when quantity becomes quality, when incremental improvements suddenly enable entirely new possibilities. The internet is a perfect example. Experts could see that computers would get faster and networks would improve. What they couldn't see was that at some point, these incremental improvements would create a qualitative shift in human communication and commerce. It's like predicting that water will get hotter without anticipating that at 100 degrees Celsius, it transforms into steam. This blindness to phase changes extends to social technologies as well. Consider democracy, perhaps the most transformative social technology in human history. For most of recorded history, the idea that common people could govern themselves was dismissed as obvious folly. Plato argued that democracy inevitably led to tyranny. Enlightenment thinkers worried that giving power to the uneducated masses would destroy civilization. Even America's founding fathers, while establishing a democratic republic, built in numerous safeguards against too much democracy. Senators were originally appointed, not elected. The Electoral College was designed to prevent direct democracy. Property requirements limited who could vote. The idea of universal suffrage seemed as absurd as expecting everyone to become philosophers. Yet democracy, despite its messiness and imperfections, has proven remarkably successful at generating prosperity, innovation, and human flourishing. The social technology that experts said would lead to chaos instead created the conditions for the greatest expansion of human welfare in history, not because the masses were secretly wise, but because distributed decision-making proved more adaptive than centralized control. The pattern extends to economic technologies. Paper money was denounced as worthless when first introduced. How could a piece of paper have value? Money needed to be made of precious metal, something with intrinsic worth. The idea that value could be based on collective belief rather than physical properties seemed like dangerous delusion. Credit cards faced similar skepticism. Who would trust a piece of plastic? How could merchants verify transactions? Wouldn't fraud be rampant? The infrastructure required seemed impossibly complex. Yet today, physical cash is disappearing in many societies, replaced by electronic transactions that exist only as patterns of data. Cryptocurrency represents the latest iteration of this pattern. Bitcoin and its descendants are dismissed by many economists as speculative bubbles, technological solutions in search of problems. The volatility, the energy consumption, the association with crime all echo criticisms faced by previous monetary innovations. Whether cryptocurrencies will transform finance or fade away remains uncertain, but their dismissal by experts follows a familiar script. Speaking of scripts, let's examine how technologies of storytelling have faced resistance. The novel, now considered a fundamental art form, was denounced as dangerous when it emerged. 18th century critics worried that novels would corrupt young minds, especially those of women. Reading fiction was seen as a waste of time at best, morally corrupting at worst. The motion picture faced similar moral panic. Early films were condemned as vulgar entertainment that would destroy theatre and corrupt audiences. The ability to show moving images seemed almost supernatural, potentially dangerous to mental health. Some religious leaders declared movies a tool of the devil designed to lead people away from righteousness. When television arrived, the criticism intensified. It would ruin children's eyes, destroy reading, eliminate conversation, turn people into passive zombies. Newton Minow, chairman of the FCC, famously called television a vast wasteland in 1961. Intellectuals competed to denounce TV in the most colourful terms. Yet television also brought Shakespeare to millions who would never see a stage production. It let people witness historical events as they happened. It created new art forms, from the situation comedy to the documentary series. The technology dismissed as culturally destructive became perhaps the most powerful cultural force of the 20th century. Video games faced the next wave of technological moral panic. They would make children violent, antisocial, and stupid. Critics couldn't see past Pong and Space Invaders to imagine the sophisticated narratives, beautiful artistry, and complex problem-solving that games would eventually offer. The idea that video games could be art, that they could tell stories as powerful as any novel or film, seemed laughable. Today, the video game industry is larger than Hollywood. Games like The Last of Us or Journey create emotional experiences that rival any traditional art form. Multiplayer games connect millions of people across continents. Educational games teach everything from history to programming. The medium dismissed as mindless entertainment has become a dominant cultural force. Virtual reality and augmented reality now face the familiar criticisms. They'll isolate people, create addiction, blur the line between real and fake. All valid concerns, just as every transformative technology brought real risks alongside revolutionary benefits. But focusing only on the dangers blinds us to possibilities we can't yet imagine. Here's where our story takes another fascinating turn. The technologies that transform society most profoundly are often those that democratize capabilities previously reserved for elites. The printing press democratized knowledge, the automobile democratized mobility, the camera democratized image making, the internet democratized publishing. Each faced resistance from those who benefited from the previous scarcity. Consider the camera. When photography was invented in the 1830s, portrait painters declared it the death of art. The French poet Charles Baudelaire called photography art's most mortal enemy. Critics argued that mechanical reproduction could never capture the soul that a painter revealed. Photography was dismissed as mere technical trickery, incapable of true artistic expression. Yet photography didn't kill painting, it freed it. Released from the burden of mere representation, painting evolved into impressionism, expressionism, abstraction. Meanwhile, photography developed its own artistic language, revealing aspects of reality invisible to the naked eye. The technology that threatened to destroy art instead multiplied its possibilities. The pattern repeated with recorded music. John Philip Sousa, the famous composer, testified to Congress in 1906 that recorded music would destroy the vocal cords of the nation. Without the need to make music themselves, people would lose the ability to sing. Music would become the province of machines rather than human expression. Instead, recorded music created an explosion of musical creativity. People didn't stop singing, they sang along to records. New genres emerged that could only exist through recording technology. Jazz, rock, hip-hop, electronic music all depend on the ability to capture, manipulate, and reproduce sound. The phonograph didn't kill music, it set it free. Digital technology triggered the same fears. Digital photography would kill the art of film development. Digital music would destroy the warmth of analog recordings. Digital books would end the sensory pleasure of paper and ink. Each prediction assumed that the new technology would simply replace the old rather than create entirely new possibilities. But let's examine an even more fundamental pattern in technological resistance. Often, the most transformative technologies are those that seem to violate natural law or divine order. The deeper the violation, the fiercer the resistance. This explains why certain technologies trigger not just skepticism but moral outrage. Human flight seemed to violate the natural order. If God had intended humans to fly, he would have given us wings. The telegraph and telephone seemed to violate the natural limits of communication. Voices travelling through wires smacked of witchcraft. Television seemed to violate the boundaries of space, bringing distant images into the home through mysterious waves. Each of these technologies required people to accept that the natural order was different than they believed. The universe was stranger, more flexible, more full of possibility than common sense suggested. This psychological adjustment was often more difficult than the technical challenges of implementation. Consider organ transplantation. The idea of taking organs from one person and putting them in another seemed to violate fundamental boundaries of identity. Critics worried about the spiritual implications. Would the recipient take on characteristics of the donor? Was it playing God to extend life through such unnatural means? The first heart transplant in 1967 triggered fierce debate. Some saw it as medical miracle, others as Frankenstein science. Religious leaders disagreed about whether it was morally acceptable. The idea that human parts could be interchangeable like machine components challenged deep beliefs about the nature of human identity. Today, organ transplantation saves thousands of lives annually. The technology once seen as violating divine law is now considered a gift of life. The moral framework adjusted to accommodate the new possibility. What seemed unnatural became a supreme act of human compassion. Genetic engineering now occupies the same contested space. The ability to edit genes, to potentially eliminate inherited diseases or enhance human capabilities, triggers the same fears about playing God. Critics warn of designer babies, genetic discrimination, the loss of human nature itself. These concerns echo through history whenever technology touches the fundamentals of human existence. Yet genetic engineering also promises to eliminate terrible diseases, to feed the hungry through improved crops, to solve environmental challenges through engineered organisms. The technology that seems to threaten human nature might be essential for human survival. The pattern suggests we'll eventually accept genetic engineering, just as we accepted flying and transplantation, but only after fierce resistance. Artificial intelligence represents perhaps the ultimate violation of natural order. The idea that machines could think, that consciousness could arise from silicon and code rather than flesh and blood, challenges our most fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind and identity. No wonder it triggers such passionate debate. Critics argue that AI is merely sophisticated pattern matching, that true consciousness requires biological substrate, that machines can never truly understand or create. These arguments echo through centuries of technological resistance. They may be right, or they may join the long list of expert pronouncements about impossibility. But there's so much more to explore about how we adapt to impossible technologies. One of the most fascinating aspects is how quickly the impossible becomes invisible. Technologies that seemed magical, threatening, or revolutionary fade into the background of daily life with stunning speed. Consider electricity. The idea of harnessing lightning, of making power flow through wires to create light and motion, seemed like the ultimate violation of natural order. Early electrical demonstrations were presented as magic shows. People paid to receive electrical shocks as entertainment. The transformation of society through electrification was as profound as any in human history. Yet today, electricity is so fundamental that we only notice it when it's absent. The miraculous became mundane in less than a century. Children growing up with electricity cannot imagine life without it. The technology that seemed to violate divine law became as natural as breathing. The same invisibility cloaks every successful technology. The automobile transformed from devil's carriage to daily commute. The telephone evolved from electrical toy to essential utility. The computer shifted from giant brain to invisible assistant embedded in every device. The internet went from information superhighway to simply the way things work. This invisibility of successful technology reveals something profound about human adaptability. We are meaning-making machines. constantly rewriting our stories to incorporate new realities. The technology that seems alien and threatening today becomes the unquestioned foundation of tomorrow's world. Consider how smartphones have become extensions of ourselves in less than 2 decades. The device that seemed unnecessary, even ridiculous, when introduced has become so essential that phantom vibration syndrome, feeling your phone vibrate when it hasn't, is a recognized phenomenon. We've developed new social norms, new etiquettes, new anxieties around these devices that didn't exist for any previous generation. Children growing up with smartphones cannot conceive of navigating without GPS, communicating without instant messaging, or learning without immediate access to all human knowledge. What seemed revolutionary to their parents is simply reality to them. The impossible has become not just possible, but essential. This adaptability extends beyond individual technologies to entire technological ecosystems. The modern world depends on intricate networks of interdependent technologies, each building on others in ways that would seem impossibly complex to previous generations. Your smartphone depends on satellites for GPS, cellular towers for communication, power grids for charging, internet protocols for data transfer, and countless other technologies working in seamless coordination. The complexity that emerges from these interconnected systems exceeds any individual's comprehension. No single person understands every component of a smartphone or the internet or the global financial system. We've created technological ecosystems that function beyond our ability to fully grasp them, yet we navigate them daily without difficulty. This brings us to a profound realization about expertise and prediction. The specialists who dismiss new technologies often do so because they understand current systems too well. They see all the reasons why something shouldn't work according to existing paradigms. The outsiders who create breakthroughs often succeed precisely because they don't fully grasp why their ideas are impossible. The Wright brothers succeeded partly because they weren't aeronautical engineers steeped in the impossibility of flight. Steve Jobs created the iPhone because he wasn't a telecommunications engineer who knew why touchscreens couldn't work. Elon Musk pursued electric vehicles and reusable rockets because he wasn't an automotive or aerospace engineer who understood why these things were impossible. This isn't to say expertise is worthless. Deep knowledge remains essential for incremental progress and refinement, but revolutionary breakthroughs often come from those who combine just enough knowledge to be dangerous with just enough ignorance to be fearless. They operate in the sweet spot between competence and naivety. There's also the crucial role of timing in technological acceptance. Many dismissed technologies were actually premature rather than impossible. Leonardo da Vinci designed helicopters and parachutes centuries before materials and engines existed to build them. Charles Babbage conceived programmable computers in the 1800s, but lacked the precision manufacturing to construct them. The Apple Newton, a personal digital assistant released in 1993, failed spectacularly. Critics mocked its size, price, and handwriting recognition. Yet it contained essentially the same concept as the iPhone, just 15 years too early. The technology wasn't wrong, the timing was. This temporal dimension of innovation suggests that many currently dismissed technologies may simply await their moment. Quantum computers, nuclear fusion, brain-computer interfaces, life extension technologies, all face skepticism today. Some will undoubtedly fail, but others may transform society in ways we cannot imagine, just waiting for complementary technologies or social changes to enable their success. The history of failed predictions also reveals the danger of extrapolation. Experts often predict the future by extending current trends, missing the discontinuities that define technological revolution. They see faster horses, not automobiles, better telegraphs, not telephones, more powerful mainframes, not personal computers. In 1894, the Times of London predicted that by 1950, every street in the city would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. The calculation was mathematically sound, based on the growth rate of horse-drawn transport. What they couldn't foresee was that horses would disappear from city streets entirely, replaced by technologies that didn't yet exist. Similarly, predictions about computer technology often missed the mark by assuming current paradigms would simply scale up. Early computer scientists imagined building size computers serving entire cities, missing the miniaturization that would put computers in every pocket. They foresaw greater centralization when the revolution lay in decentralization. This brings us to an uncomfortable truth about our current moment. We are almost certainly dismissing technologies today that will seem obviously transformative to future generations. Our descendants will look back at our skepticism with the same bemused wonder we feel toward those who dismissed the internet or smartphones. What might these technologies be? Perhaps brain-computer interfaces that seem creepy and invasive today will become as natural as eyeglasses. Maybe genetic engineering that frightens us will eliminate diseases our grandchildren can't imagine suffering from. Possibly virtual worlds we dismiss as escapism will become primary venues for work, education, and social connection. Or perhaps the transformative technologies are ones we haven't even conceived yet. The most profound changes often come from directions nobody anticipated. Who in 1990 could have predicted that a website for rating college dorm mates would evolve into Facebook? Who in 2000 foresaw that a search engine would become one of the world's most powerful companies? Let's delve deeper into the role of infrastructure in technological adoption. One reason experts often dismiss new technologies is they correctly identify the massive infrastructure changes required for adoption. They're right that these changes seem impossibly expensive and complex. What they miss is humanity's remarkable ability to build new infrastructures when the motivation exists. The automobile required not just cars but roads, gas stations, repair shops, traffic laws, driver education, insurance systems, and countless other supporting structures. The telephone needed not just handsets, but switching stations, telephone lines spanning continents, operators, directory systems, and new social protocols for remote conversation. Each infrastructure requirement seemed insurmountable until it wasn't. When demand emerged, humans found ways to build the necessary supports. The infrastructure that seemed impossible became invisible, absorbed into the background of daily life. Today's children can't imagine a world without highways any more than they can imagine one without the internet. The infrastructure challenge repeats with every transformative technology. Electric vehicles require charging networks, renewable energy needs new power grids, virtual reality demands massive computational power and bandwidth. Each requirement becomes an argument for impossibility, until suddenly it doesn't. Consider the mobile phone infrastructure. Building cellular networks required thousands of towers, complex switching systems, international roaming agreements, and regulatory frameworks that didn't exist. The investment required seemed astronomical. The coordination between companies and countries appeared impossible. Yet it happened, driven by consumer demand and competitive pressure. Today, we're witnessing similar infrastructure transformations. Satellite internet constellations promise to bring broadband to every corner of Earth. Autonomous vehicles will require smart roads and new traffic management systems. Renewable energy is driving construction of continent-spanning supergrids. Each seems impossibly complex and expensive until it becomes inevitable. But infrastructure isn't just physical. Even more challenging are the social infrastructures, the laws, norms, and institutions that must evolve to accommodate new technologies. The automobile required driver's licenses, traffic courts, and liability insurance. The internet demanded new laws about digital property, online commerce, and data privacy. These social adaptations often lag behind technological development, creating friction and conflict. But societies eventually develop the necessary frameworks, usually through messy compromise and gradual evolution, rather than elegant design. The social infrastructure that seems impossible to change proves surprisingly adaptable when pressure builds. This adaptability extends to human behavior itself. Technologies don't just serve existing needs, they create new behaviors and desires. Before the telephone, people didn't feel the need for instant voice communication across distances. Before television, families didn't gather around screens in the evening. Before social media, people didn't feel compelled to broadcast their daily activities. Each technology creates new forms of human behavior that would have seemed bizarre or pathological to previous generations. Teenagers spending hours on phones, adults binge watching entire seasons of shows, people sharing intimate details with strangers online, all would have seemed like mental illness to our ancestors. Yet these behaviors now seem normal, even inevitable. This behavioral adaptability suggests that future technologies will create equally strange new patterns of human activity. Perhaps people will spend hours in virtual worlds that seem more real than reality. Maybe direct brain interfaces will enable forms of communication that make current social media seem primitive. Possibly genetic modifications will create new human capabilities that redefine normal behavior. The technologies that seem most alien and threatening often become most essential to human flourishing. Vaccination seemed unnatural but eliminated diseases that killed millions. Electricity seemed dangerous but enabled civilization to transcend the limits of daylight. The internet seemed frivolous but connected humanity in unprecedented ways. Let's examine one more pattern in technological resistance. Often, the fiercest critics of new technologies are those who succeeded with previous ones. The railroad barons fought automobiles. Telegraph companies dismissed telephones. Film studios resisted television. Record labels battled digital music. In each case, successful incumbents couldn't see past their own innovations to the next transformation. This incumbent blindness extends beyond business to entire societies. Countries that lead in one technological era often lag in the next. Britain dominated the steam age but struggled with electrification. America led in automobiles and aviation but initially lagged in mobile phones. Japan pioneered consumer electronics but missed the internet revolution. The pattern suggests that technological leadership creates its own form of blindness. Success with existing paradigms makes it harder to recognize when those paradigms are shifting. The expertise and infrastructure that create advantage in one era become barriers to recognizing the next transformation. This has profound implications for how we think about current technological leaders and laggards. The companies and countries that dominate today's digital landscape may be poorly positioned for whatever comes next. Their very success may blind them to emerging possibilities that seem impossible from their current perspective. As we near the end of our journey through humanity's catalogue of dismissed technologies, let's consider what lessons we might draw from this parade of failed predictions. The first and most obvious is humility. If the brightest minds of every generation have been consistently wrong about technological possibility, we should be deeply skeptical of confident pronouncements about what can't be done. But there's a deeper lesson about the nature of possibility itself. The boundary between possible and impossible isn't fixed. It shifts with each breakthrough, each new combination of existing technologies, each creative leap by someone who doesn't know it can't be done. The impossible is simply the possible waiting for the right moment, the right person, the right confluence of supporting technologies. There's also a lesson about human adaptability. Every generation fears that new technologies will destroy human nature, corrupt the youth, or undermine civilization. Yet humans consistently adapt to new technologies, finding ways to remain recognizably human while transcending previous limitations. We are infinitely more adaptable than we believe ourselves to be. Perhaps, most importantly, there's a lesson about optimism and persistence. Every transformative technology faced dismissal, ridicule, and opposition. The inventors and entrepreneurs who changed the world weren't necessarily smarter or more talented than the skeptics. They were simply more persistent, more willing to pursue possibilities that others had dismissed. This isn't to say every dismissed technology will succeed. For every airplane and iPhone, there are countless perpetual motion machines and flying cars that really were impossible or impractical. The challenge is distinguishing between genuine impossibility and the blindness of conventional wisdom. Given our track record, we should err on the side of possibility. As you drift off to sleep tonight, perhaps you'll dream of technologies yet to come. Flying cars that actually work, teleportation devices that make distance irrelevant, medical breakthroughs that extend healthy life indefinitely, brain enhancements that unlock human potential, energy sources that make scarcity obsolete. Some of these may remain dreams, but history suggests that reality will exceed our wildest imaginings. The story of dismissed technologies is ultimately a story about human creativity and determination. It's about the dreamers who refuse to accept that something is impossible, the inventors who persist despite ridicule, the early adopters who see potential where others see problems. It's about the magnificent stubbornness of humans who hear that something can't be done and respond, "Watch me." In our modern world, surrounded by technologies that were once dismissed as impossible, it's easy to forget how unlikely our present reality once seemed. Every device you use, every capability you take for granted, was once the subject of scoffing dismissal by respected experts. The screen you're watching, the network delivering this content, the very idea that you could access any information anywhere at any time, all were declared impossible by people who should have known better. Yet here we are, living in yesterday's impossible future, preparing to dismiss tomorrow's transformative technologies with the same confident certainty. The cycle continues, as it always has, with experts explaining why the next breakthrough can't possibly work, while somewhere, in a garage or laboratory or dorm room, someone who hasn't read the expert opinions is busy making the impossible possible. So as you settle into sleep surrounded by impossible technologies that have become invisible through familiarity, remember that the future will be stranger, more wonderful, and more transformative than our current experts can imagine. The technologies they dismiss today may be the ones your grandchildren can't imagine living without. The impossible is always just one stubborn dreamer away from becoming inevitable. Sweet dreams of impossible futures.